Welcome back to DemystifySci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
This is the podcast where we search for the theories that will change the world. And today we are sitting down with futurist Michael Vassar to discuss what it means to be an actual thinking member of the world today. Because we live in a world that increasingly pushes you towards the nice safe space of going along with whatever tribe or party happens to be popular in your neck of the woods. And it turns out that understanding how we got to this point is a real wild ride that Michael seems to have a great deal of knowledge about historically. So a lot of this conversation is tracing the origins of both the legal system that we've inherited, which seems to be broken in many ways, as well as the education system, which, you guessed it, also seems to be quite broken in a similar way, and tracking out ideally a path forward, right? Because the entire point of our project certainly is to learn how to think by examining different sides of theories, right? We're trying to look at how things work in the world, and the best way that we know how to do that seems to be by seeing different arguments for that same phenomena. And I believe that Michael, who comes from this rationalist community in the Bay Area, would agree with is that the only way to understand things and to actually learn how to think is to practice doing that, to take apart both sides of an argument, to evaluate where the two meet, where things fall apart, and ideally plot a path forward. But it does seem to be a bit of a lost art because, as you're well aware, most of our conditioning in this society, the education that we were all subjected to growing up, is based on taking tests about facts. It's based on getting in line and doing what you're told. And that's not really compatible with perhaps coming up with different conclusions that might get you in trouble. So there's an element of courage that has to be discussed in this matter as well. And we get to that by the end.
In some ways, it's a conversation I've been wanting to have for a long time because the Rationalists are an incredibly powerful community in terms of just learning how to think. Like in the last 20 or 30 years, they might be the only ones that have really dedicated themselves to trying to reignite the values of the Enlightenment, which is to say that there is actually a truth that can be understood, and there are strategies that you can employ to get to that truth. And yet they seem to have fallen short in really getting these ideas widely accepted, and I've never really totally understood why they haven't caught on. And so it was really good to have Michael around to be able to kind of unpack a little bit of that, but I will say that it seems like in many ways we have just begun to scratch the surface, because this is a community that has been around since probably the early 90s and has kind of like a glossomania. Their entire identity is transmitted through copious amounts of blog posts. And so there's not a single place where you can go and you can be like, this is what the rationalist community thinks. And so it's very useful to have somebody that has a at least working understanding of the inner parts of the community. Hopefully we'll talk to Michael again.
I mean, part of the problem that he points to is that the community sold out, which is something you hear all of the time, right? And what does it mean to sell out? It really means to lay down your actual goal and trample on it in favor of growing something, usually some sort of profit structure, that in some way is misaligned with your actual goal. And that is something that we are hell-bent on preserving at DemystifySci here, right? It seems like as soon as, even if you're a nonprofit, you need to sacrifice to the grant givers, right? If you start selling products, you need to sacrifice to the sponsors. And we're not doing any of that. That doesn't mean that it doesn't cost money to feed ourselves, keep the lights on, put on conferences, go and film live interviews. And the best way that we can think of to do that authentically is to be supported by you guys. So we need you to consider supporting this project. And you can do it for almost nothing. So the law of large numbers says that if all of you give us 25 cents, 50 cents, 75 cents, we will have plenty of gas to pull off all of those projects that I just listed. So come on over to patreon.com/demystifysci, check it out. For 75 cents a week, you can support this project and make this a powerful platform where we can just focus on what we're trying to do here, which is ultimately understanding how the world works and hopefully teaching ourselves and all of us how to think better in the process.
As part of that mission, we have also started a new segment that we are calling Paradigm Drift. And the way that it works is that all month long, we collect theorists, put their names in a hat, and then at showtime, we pick names randomly. And those who get picked get 60 seconds to present their theory of how they think the world works. And so for us, this is a way of getting as many ideas out into the world as possible, curating a space where we have a community that is curious about ideas and can help people workshop their theories, try to figure out how to talk about ideas better, and really just have a place that celebrates new ways of thinking. And so if you have an idea about the world, sign up at the link below. If you just like ideas, consider coming to the next Paradigm Drift taping, which will be on October, probably the first or second week of October. We haven't scheduled it yet, but if you go to the link below, it'll have all the details for the taping. And I think that even if you don't have a theory, it is really, really, really important for you to come to the taping, because this is not to be a community where everybody shows up, yells their theory out into the world, and then leaves. It is intended to be a place where people can gather to discuss ideas. And so
I would go so far as to say it's not even about your theory necessarily, about you getting a microphone to shout your ideas to the world. The whole point is really to be part of that discussion, to stay there, to hang out, and actually all together figure out how to think about things more clearly. That's the point. So sure, you get to present your idea, but you're only one little piece of the puzzle, and nobody has the entire theory of everything, despite what the popular booksellers will tell you. The truth comes from putting the ideas against one another, and that's what we're doing here.
all that said, enjoy a conversation with Michael Vassar about why it seems that nobody knows how to think anymore. I'll see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
DemystifySci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
I thought it might be interesting to start with a question of, like, does the world look the way that it does right now on purpose or by accident?
I mean, you need optimization pressure to generate vision. You need optimization pressure to generate the eye and the brain, the signal processing even within the cells that allows the world to look like anything at all.
I want to clarify. So when I say that the world looks, I mean not necessarily in like the biophysical processing of the world, but I mean the social structures that we're embedded in, the networks of ideas, the social movements, like all of these things that are kind of the
Or,
water in which we
or
swim.
even some of the more chaotic elements of modernity, right? So the basic threats that we face or that we're told that we face, how much of that is intentional versus how much of that is just second, third order effects of really well-intentioned elite social engineers?
So like to I think to draw this to a point, I've been listening to you talk about mistake theory versus conflict theory. And I've been kind of looking at, and the rationalist community is deeply in the realm of, looking at the world through the lens of mistake theory as opposed to the lens of conflict theory. I think that you might be more in the realm of, I don't want to necessarily say conflict theory, but there's some other like higher dimensional aspect of the mistake versus conflict theory that framework doesn't capture. And so I
I
wonder,
appreciate that. I appreciate your saying that. And I was being entirely earnest and not nerdy when I tried to describe the concept of looking and how it relates to what it is for the world looking some way to be intentional or accidental, and what sort of a thing an intention is. So, like, I was once asked to talk to Adam Curtis, who does things like Machines of Loving Grace, and about I believe it was the Great Reset, because someone thought that he should make a thing based on what I was saying about the Great Reset. And I'm like, well, the trouble is Adam Curtis is like manifesting. He is producing images that are supposed to be reproduced vividly in the minds of audiences as something like a stable attractor, which they can coordinate towards by singing together. And that's different from how it looks to be like not so visually, more somatically in intuition or preconceptually feeling around, you might say, for like ways not to hurt yourself. Like if you're vividly imagining sticking your finger in the electric socket, you're probably more likely to be sticking your finger in the electric socket. But if you are like aware that there are dangerous things around and are cautious in general, not allocating to a strong bias towards the visual information coming in, or, and not reacting in your movements without categorizing and interpreting the information. Like there's a thing that it is to be cautious that is not imagining. There's a thing that it is to avoid a thing that is in some sense specifically not imagining. Like a chess master specifically doesn't imagine all of the wrong moves.
So
And
do you think there's something dangerous about actually visualizing the fiery crash?
I think that it is more. People say it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, and that's dangerous because, like, if there's an end of capitalism and people imagine that as the end of the world, they are attracting themselves into enacting an end of the world drama. I think there was a movie called Leave the World Behind fairly recently. You saw it?
Mm-hmm.
Did we?
Yeah, we did. That's the one where there's this group of families and they go on vacation
Oh,
somewhere,
yeah.
and then like some kind of war breaks out, and then like all the communications go
Is this the
down.
Nick Cage movie?
I don't.
Salim Ismail. It's Julia
It's
Roberts, Salim Ismail, black family, white family in the New York countryside.
there's like a really distinct scene where there's this huge container ship that runs aground while they're on the beach, and that's like the first sign.
I
Do
kind
you
of
remember
vaguely
this?
remember
Yeah.
this, yeah.
I mean, but so elaborate on how you link this
It's a
movie to it.
movie about a coup with some disinformation and, somewhat terroristic attacks, but being interpreted by people who are totally helpless. The horror in the horror movie is about the helplessness of the people, their total unthoughtfulness about how they are going to survive, but simply projecting on it either everything is normal and it'll go back to normal soon, or it's the end of the world as the only possibilities, and just allowing themselves to be in way, way worse danger than the actual severity of the situation. It's like a realistic horror movie because that's the sort of horror we're facing. It's just like Don't Look Up is a realistic horror movie.
Well, it seems like something that we've been talking about recently is the fact that in many ways it feels like we're all passengers in a roller coaster. Like there's somebody who's kind of at the controls who makes the car go, and there's a set of tracks along which the roller coaster goes, but you as the passenger have really only the choice between getting into the roller coaster or getting off of it, but once you've committed to being inside of it, there's not really much effect that you can exert upon the course of what's about to happen to you.
And the guy in front doesn't have much control either. He just has one dimension more control than you have.
Right. And so I think that there is this sense that has been growing more and more, and maybe even as technology and all of these institutional structures kind of calcify around people, the sense that despite the fact that we are ostensibly in a society that is progressing, like we're moving forward, we're moving towards something, there's constant innovation, there's constant technological progress, there's geopolitical machinations, it doesn't necessarily feel like there is really a way that those machinations feed back in a positive way on people's lives. despite the fact that everybody's very materially comfortable. And so I feel like there's this weird sense of like being inside of a machine where you are watching it operate around you and you survive by dint of its mercy as opposed to by virtue of being some like useful component of that machine. Does that make sense?
Seems like progressivism and liberalism have split paths entirely. Being in a roller coaster is not very liberated, but it's definitely making progress.
And so, like, when we talked earlier, we kind of talked about one of the things that you said is that, like, people don't really know how to encounter ideas very well anymore. And
Mhm.
do you think that
Which is
those,
kind of in line with the idea that we can only fixate on the crash or the past. Like, this is a disaster, or we should go back to the beginning. It's like and I noticed this during the pandemic too. Like, there was this moment where it was like, okay, everything's completely fucked. But we could actually make a really good situation out of this, right? We had this cool conversation, one of the earliest podcast conversations we had with Doug about the cities of the future, like how things could be reoriented to deal with this new distributed, decentralized workforce. And it was like a moment where there could have been all this beautiful innovation, but instead people freak out about the disaster dystopia, or they want to get back to things being normal as quickly as possible. It's like, and you see this in the realm of ideas as well, where it's how do we there's certain ideas that are just like Swiss cheese on the landscape. They're just too much trouble to even go near. And you get to a point where people seem to not be able to think for themselves by and large. And I don't know if they were ever able to think for themselves. I've only been alive a little while. But
So I think that's the big question. We have a very rich textual history that shows that our documents assume that people can think for themselves unequivocally in the English language prior to the 19th century. And there's this very slow changeover, basically mostly starting after the Great Depression in English, but starting much earlier in German, to documents that assume that people cannot think for themselves.
can you point to some examples of that?
Sure. So Freud is sort of a central figure in the German story, where he's sort of making the idea that people cannot think for themselves, and that this is a manifestly obvious thing that we all understand, mainstream. But Kant is complaining about it as early as what is Enlightenment in maybe 1784. 17, something like that. So broadly, Germany also assumes that people can think for themselves back in Leibniz's time, and basically in the sort of Lutheran tradition between and the associated pietists and the like, from like the Reformation, peaking maybe a generation or two after Leibniz, and with like Christian, what's his name? Christian? No, it's not. His
Huygens?
something to do. Christian Wolff. Sorry,
Wolf.
Christian Wolff. Who Kant calls the greatest of the dogmatic philosophers, and who sort of is driven out of his hometown for inventing a Neo-Confucian, Euro-Confucianism as a proposed replacement for Christianity, which the locals back in the 18th century aren't fond of. But like, there's this strong assumption implicit in the persecution of Galileo that people can think. We are sufficiently worried that we won't be able to sell the words in this Bible that they can't read to the peasants if they hear they can rotate shapes in their mind. And that shows that the Bible isn't true. So there's a expectation of deeply connected thought implicit in the tradition we're coming from that drops away in different sub-traditions at different times, which we call the transition from the Enlightenment to the Romantic period, modernity, post-modernity, etc. Like we have like in the humanities, this is like the normal model of the world that there was. I guess Habermas is maybe the most central canonical figure right now with the EU, etc. But that there was a time when in some large group of people in coffee shops, etc., started talking as if they were laying aside their prejudices and pretending to be curious and socially equal and looking to show off thinking outside of the box. And like eventually this leads to some level of perverse showing off how out of the box you are. And late Enlightenment figures like Rousseau seem to always be trying to think of why you should be bad and why black is white and progress is slavery. Or worse, like, it's worse than that. Like, when Rousseau imagines a noble savage, he is imagining a person who does not think explicitly, and he's seeing that as better. It's not, he's not imagining someone like us living in nature harmoniously. He's imagining something that is less like us than a chimp, maybe less like us than a bear.
What do you mean that he can't think?
Like, the figure of Rousseau's story who has not a care in the world, and as long as he has food in his belly, is friend to the world. That figure doesn't form families or narratives. Like, the Rousseauian conception of a noble savage is not inspired by, like, the discovery of the New World and we find people living like this. This is, like, vaguely inspired by it, the way The Tempest is vaguely inspired by it. But it's like imagining a mental state more different from ours than a chimp's is from our actual mental state, you know, without past and future and grudges and interests, a thing of pure reflex and impulse. So, like, he's advocating for values that are as shocking and hard to argue for as possible because he's the most articulate writer in the world and everyone acknowledges it. And the way you get acknowledged for that is by taking the most outrageous claims and making them flowery and beautiful and could it be so and interesting. But he's still an Enlightenment figure because he's still basically showing off, thinking on his own, out of the box, freely. And Kant is saying that that's what makes you an Enlightenment figure, and what is Enlightenment? He would certainly think his friend Rousseau, and he didn't, I don't think, meet. Rousseau spent time with Hume. Hume was very important by Kant. I don't think that Kant met, but he said that he needed to read each essay twice after it came out, so that he didn't, read it once and be influenced by it unduly because it's so well written and convincing. So, people used to think that they and others could be convinced of things, that it was dangerous to be convinced of bad things because people are showing off their ability to be convincing. They used to think that maybe we could decide together how to do a thing, and it doesn't make sense to create a colony, to imagine that people could create a colony without thinking together, deciding, being convinced, gathering information. It doesn't really make sense to think that they could form a government that way, or a pirate ship even. And if it doesn't make sense that you could do a pirate ship even, then it follows that there are lots of people in our society who presumably still are thinking, people who are living in more dangerous lives, more closely connected to the ground, but our society does very little to voice their interests, thoughts, concerns, or encourage them to be compensated for sharing them and to correlate their understandings of the world. We have maybe shows like Ice Road Truckers, but we don't have a norm where you don't get a, say, philosophy PhD until having, like, careers in both higher class and lower class professions, which would casually seem like a good idea.
And so, are you making the case that there's this erosion of the ability to think outside of the box?
Actually, it's an erosion of the ability to think, period. People could call it think outside the box, but it's not really about thinking outside the box. It's not an erosion of creative thinking. It's more like an erosion of what we would call, I think, Category 4 literacy on national literacy tests and better. It's like the level. There was a recent article about this, talking about how maybe 1% of the population, most English majors, are unable, like, large majority of English majors are unable to make even the most basic interpretation
This
of the
was
first paragraph of Bleak House. Yeah, you were saying?
Yeah, so it was a bunch of freshmen at the University of Kansas, I think, were given the first paragraph of Dickens's Bleak House, and they were asked to analyze what was happening in the passage. And obviously, it's written in kind of archaic English, but the vast majority
Well,
of
not
this,
very archaic. You should read it. It's like a teeny bit archaic.
yeah, like there's some terms that you probably wouldn't come across if you weren't particularly well read, and so like
True, but they also had use of ChatGPT and search. They didn't have to do this on their own, and they still couldn't do it.
yeah, like they couldn't parse the meaning. There's some like metaphorical language because like the streets are muddy. And so this character is like slogging through this muddy street and he's talking about this like, like antediluvian biblical scene almost. And the kids just have no context in which they can parse the metaphor. And so the professor asks like, what do you think this means? And they literally like don't have the ability to make the abstract jump
I
to the fact that
literally think
this
he's
is a
saying a
metaphor.
dinosaur is walking down the street.
Is
Because he
this
uses
is this reflective of the institutionalization of not being able to think? Is this sort of, in some sense, if we go back to the Galileo story, like it's in the church's best interest? They're the sort of knowledge power structure, knowledge authority of the day. And so it's in their best
church is a knowledge structure that is keeping power by depriving people of information, but it doesn't assume that it has the ability to deprive them of the ability to think. It assumes that they can still think, even though it has deprived them of all information, and that if they look in a telescope and hear that the Bible story about the sky is wrong, they'll think that that means the church doesn't have power over their souls, and they should start thinking for themselves. Like, the church doesn't assume that people are incapable of thinking, or they wouldn't be bothered by Galileo.
Mm.
But today, the question becomes, what are the incentives that are pressing on these institutions to have gone down this route?
So I actually, as Michael, you were talking, I had this thought where it seems like in order to think, you have to have a like a space in which you're solving problems. And it seems like something that you said about like you have to make a colony, you have to make a government, you have to make a pirate ship. There's all of these organizations on the edges of the social circle where you have to actually be able to solve problems or you will not survive. And in the absence of that empty space to move into, it seems like the necessity for thought becomes gradually abrogated because you're literally just living inside of a system that will provide you all of the inputs that you need, and you kind of just weave those together in some minimal way and then go on your day without being like, well, hold on a second. Are there other inputs that we can create? Is there somewhere to go where we can do this de novo?
Yeah, and markets were an eternal threshold in that way that made thinking very profitable, both in money and in offspring, for a long time in the Netherlands and in Switzerland and in England. And so after the Protestant Reformation is somewhat triggered, possibly, by people who've been thinking in this way, a larger demographic of such people, and also with more power and knowledge and more of a network thinking this way. Like, this started a shift in England's system of power to a world where these market actors, the bourgeoisie who were descended from yeomen, were taking the yeomanly thinking that worked well as a yeoman and also worked well as a bourgeois, and extending their power into mercantile trades and into aristocratic turf, into organizing violence and into deciding together kind of how they thought things should be done. And this was really far enough on the way that in Henry VIII's time that he could pay off a lot of these people with money, land he stole from the church, and turn them into a new power base under him that was a partial counterbalance to the aristocracy. And then by a century later, Cromwell had overthrown the whole royalty. The bloodline had lost power to the people with money and thinking and doing. And so France was England's traditional rival that had gone from being far more powerful for centuries to being less powerful to now being much less powerful. And it played catch up by a certain game of consolidating power with the king under Cardinal Richelieu and Louis XIII. And they had a less libertarian free market. It's not like anarcho-capitalists took over the government like happened in England. I mean, it's actually anarcho-capitalists from the Netherlands ended up taking over England's government in cooperation with anarcho-capitalists in England in what's called the Glorious Revolution in 1689, and they create the Church of William and Mary and the Bank of England. And so they invent the modern constitutional monarchy, where modern people think of it as if constitutional means constrained, but the British Constitution isn't constrained in any sense. There isn't a written set of constraints. It's constitutional in the sense of knowing that it's made of something. So it's not a posturing monarchy. It's not a feudaldom or a cult of personality, where I present to you a role model and a figure of authority and you submit. It's more like a power structure that owns itself, that is made of a church and a bank and a navy and immunity from the law, and an understanding of how these things come together to constitute an ability to some degree and not to an unlimited degree, survey on the public and compel their speech and action one way or another. It's realist in the way that Hamlet is realist instead of fairy tale princess, the way any concept of an absolute monarch has to be fairy tale princess because no one can be absolute. You could call it a materialist monarchy. A Hobbesian Leviathan, even.
Okay, and so then how does this revolution, where people do seem to be thinking and they are constructing these new systems, slowly start to transform from the inventive frame into something that is significantly deteriorated?
So I said the French did a meritocratic version of the thing to play catch up. They grew their economy faster, less anarcho-capitalist, more solar king nationalist, weirdly like sort of Catholic Japanese, you might say. So the French were imitating the British, playing catch up in this centralized system, which was intrinsically less stable because it was more based on mummery, pretense, dazzle, and, awe, shock and awe, rather than based on an understanding of how the power is constituted. They built the, Central Park-sized palace, Versailles, and its statue gardens. It's really outrageous. They created this very meritocratic competitive system, which in its dying days was still pretty cool. You could watch the movie Ridicule for, I feel, a pretty good picture of what's kind of fun and sciencey about it, as well as painful and tech broy. But the French built this less stable system. It lasted for 3 generations of monarchy, 13, 14, 15, and 16th. Then it broke down, but it left behind centralized power. Napoleon took that centralized power, combined it with a more bourgeoisie, but also more warlordy vibe, and spread the sort of French bourgeois power over Europe in certain ways as a threat against all of the established aristocracies there. And when it did that, the many small kingdoms of Europe felt that they needed to band together permanently and come up with some sort of a resistance to this class war that was being waged against them as they saw it. And so there was this most of a century nationalism project from Hegel, etc., through Bismarck to unify Germany and analogous things in Italy, etc., which you could think of it as if the aristocrats are used to just farming resources from the common people. They never thought to actually know anything about them. but they send out scholars like the Brothers Grimm to investigate what the common people are like, and at different levels of development, civilizational centrality, and sort of create a cross mythology for the common people that they can have one shared identity across the kingdom, because myths from or stories or folk motifs from all of these societies are integrated. They start this long project of telling a story that there is this thing it is to be a German, a nation of Germany, as opposed to like Prussia, which contains a lot of what we'd call Poland, and does not contain that much of what we would call Germany, and which people of its time would say it's more of an army with a nation than a nation with an army. But like that was sort of the central figure in the consolidation, and then there are like Austria's big other player that's not part of this German unification, and then there's like Bavaria. But these guys consolidate, create a story of Germanness that centers power not on the bourgeoisie and not on what they call the burghers, but nominally on the Volk, the people, the culture. They use the word kultur. And you could think of it as each 50 years from the bubonic plague on, in England, the number of kind of free, affluentish people roughly doubles, and their per capita wealth roughly doubles from a fraction of a percent in like 1350 to like then call it a percent in 1450 and 4% in 1550 and 8%, 16% in 1650. And by that time, they have all the power. But before that happens in Germany, like more than 16% of the people have been sent to schools. Rather than people working, rather than the bourgeoisie expanding gradually, the Germans convert some of their population through the process of schooling into a fake version of the bourgeoisie, who are trained to be obedient nationalists, who are competitive but don't think out of the box and don't oppose authority, so that they, rather than having to restrain the suffrage of the population the way the rising bourgeoisie do in England. So like when the bourgeoisie take over England, they don't give everyone the vote. They have two houses, some only for lords, some for commoners. The commoners have most of the power. Also, the king actually has power. People are confused about this. But the bourgeoisie in that system do not initially give everyone the vote. And in England, a similar thing happens later. But like as the vote is expanding, there's a point where the aristocrats who are losing power or have lost power play a judo move, and they expand the vote to way more people than the number of people who have developed the sort of independence we were talking about developing by being self-governing and outside of society, whether it's pirates or small business owners in the city. They give to like shepherds and peasants, people who are far out in the boonies in very traditional culture and who still are in practice under the domination of some aristocrat, votes, so that those people can outvote the bourgeoisie, and the aristocracy can maintain power through the votes of the people that they effectively own. But in Germany, this was done much more aggressively. A lot more people were more effectively owned. And so basically, before the business people accumulated enough power to change the system of government, put them into charge through a parliament, the aristocrats sent peasants through schools that would give them a type of literacy that would allow them to vote and to take political ideas from the aristocrats, follow sort of basic commands, but not a type of literacy that could enable them to make and evaluate arguments which raised points for and against a topic, and compare the strength of those arguments with one another and seek reconciliation between them. That specifically is the difference between I think it's NALS, level 4 and level 3 literacy. It's the thing that the article we were talking about said only 1 in 8 people in society today have.
What was the precedent for that kind of education? How far do we have to go back to find that being a popular form of education?
I mean, this basically is from Prussia. People talk about it as the Prussian school system. And then in America, it wasn't implemented until much later, and it was done by John Dewey as pragmatism, and it was somewhat more perverse than our education system is much worse than the system that I'm describing.
I'm talking about when was it? When was it not? I'm more just asking when was it not broken? When?
Oh, there was never anything that looked at all like what you might imagine from school. There was never any non-broken thing that resembles the thing Pinocchio was supposed to go to.
Even in ancient Greece or something like that?
No, there was pederasty in ancient Greece. Kids got educated by finding a guy who was fun to talk to and sucking their cock in order to hear more interesting thoughts about wars and power.
But you don't think that guy was teaching by way of the dialogue between opposing arguments and how to evaluate arguments and negotiate?
Sometimes Plato is advocating for that. But it's not a given that's how a given kid is going to go. It's just what Plato considers respectable and admirable and thinks should be put in charge of a city. But Plato totally is taking it for granted the way modern people do that most people can't think. That's what the Republic is about. It's a matter. He's saying, hey, it seems like some people can think and some people can't. How are we supposed to manage society? Some people need to be making decisions. It's you can't have a ship without a captain who knows how to steer the ship. You're going to just die. But then he didn't really come up with a very good solution.
A solution obviously would be we need more captains, and we should probably figure out how to train people to be captains. We don't need more ships without captains. I don't know.
Yeah, I think maybe kind of Socrates' answer at the beginning of the Republic is that he says that the solution is don't have a city at all, have a hunter-gatherer band. Then you don't get to be rich and have slaves and nice things taking care of you, but you all know how to think and you're better off. But
yeah, it does
he doesn't
seem
expect
like
Athenians to take that seriously.
Well, and that seems to be the problem, right? Because if you're talking about organizing large groups of people to take on a project, you actually can't have that many captains because you immediately fall into division of schools of thought, disagreements about how to actually accomplish something. You have to have a relatively small number of people who are the ones that are...
I disagree.
Okay, go for it.
Well, I think that people have to be united in their vision about the overall objective of the mission more than anything. I think you can have this decentralized command structure in any organization as long as everybody's on board about what the ultimate goal is. If people start defecting on that ultimate goal or the goal becomes splintered, then, it doesn't matter how many few or many captains you have, it's just you're going to result in chaos.
Okay, so I think that what happens is that if you have too many people that are thinking, everybody's trying to think outside the box. Everybody's trying to identify some untrammeled ground, which is why you end up having so many different schools of thought. It inevitably fractures a society because...
But I'm saying that I don't think that the main problem is that there's all these people thinking outside the box. It's that they all have different value structures. They want a different future out of it. If they're all on board about what the future should look like, then it doesn't matter if you have a million different ways of going about it. That's probably going to result in
I don't think you need either value structures or to be on board with what the future should look like. I think you just need to be on board with what legal standing looks like. and what level of denial of due process justifies violence against the government or the overthrow of the government. I think that that's how the US did it. Everyone pretty much in the North was expected to be a captain, and certainly in the frontier they were all supposed to do so. No one could have possibly organized them efficiently enough in a hierarchical or a structure or even in a shared vision to work through the possibilities and potentialities of the land they were expanding onto. But everyone could agree about when a gentleman's honor demanded a duel. Everyone could agree on when the sinfulness of the local parish called for them to be driven out of town. That there was enough shared understanding of how to reconcile disagreements in a manner that people would be responsible for, not merely regard as a crime of passion or a state of exception.
Aren't those values, though?
Those are values that make it possible to survive a ship crossing in the tech level they had back then, and make it possible to gather a group of people to prototype a community before leaving so they don't break down. You're just not going to survive under those circumstances without values in that general reference class.
Yeah, so they have some sort of shared values. I think you're kind of pointing out a shared sense of justice or what the line of justice is. They have this shared overarching mission. I'm just like, look, if you're running a company and like...
I would call that a protocol, not a mission. That the mission is bring Christianity to the infidel, or create a city on a hill, or bring back lots of money from cotton. The missions can all be pretty different, but the thing that is important is the understanding of what a human is, what the natural protocols are for one human to relate to another human, and what it is reasonable to expect of your neighbor, of a third party, on observing some way in which two people are relating. Like, who can a third party be expected to automatically sympathize more with? The man who is beating his wife or the wife who is being beaten? To which side should people expect their reputation to benefit from siding with? What actions should they expect their reputation to benefit from being seen as taking? I think that people who don't have a relatively natural common sense for harsh environments on that are not going to survive in harsh environments.
But it sounds like what you're saying is that there's a lot of ideas floating around here, and so let me see if I can organize them a little bit. Where you're pointing to the introduction of democracy as being a condition where there is suddenly a larger number of people that are taking part in the process of making decisions about what the mission is, that are not necessarily educated to the standard of this abstract level of being able to really weigh which mission they should align themselves with. And in the background of all of this, there's philosophers that are trying to actually figure out what the mission should be, given that the Enlightenment has abrogated some of the authority of the Bible. Now they're thinking outside of the box, they're trying on all of these ideas. And so you have this kind of filtering where you have the philosophers that are speaking to the elites. The elites are making decisions about which philosophies they align with. And then they are transmitting those messages down through whatever population they either control or have influence over in order to make the final outcome of government look the way that they want it to look. Is that a fair summary so far?
So I feel like the elites are going to differ fairly radically regarding what they would mean the word philosophy to even mean.
Mm.
So, what a natural philosopher like Newton means by philosophy is maybe pretty different from what both a rationalist philosopher like Plato or an empiricist philosopher like Aristotle means. And what a metaphysician like Hegel means is even more different still. And there is a break after Kant between the elites of a more aristocratic background on the continent who choose to validate as philosophy a hinting at the sorts of practices whereby people can have power by disavowing their personal responsibility and treating their behaviors as determined by their circumstances, where they can do what Kahneman calls the fundamental attribution error of imagining that other people's bad behavior is caused by their disposition and yours is caused by your circumstances, or worse, doing normalizing antisocial behavior and claiming that everyone is always extracting as is compelled by all people's circumstances ever, and every social organization is always just a gang. So there are advantages for the people in power to replace the question of how do we know things and how do we be just with the question of how does power secretly hold you and how do you serve it and seek to be elevated by it. And this can be like aestheticized as Romanticism. How do you show you're special? How do you show you should be entitled to favor, that your deep inner essence is more worthy and you're the sort of person who really matters? And, people did some cool things in the name of Romanticism, but it's basically pretty bad values. And it ends up kind of fighting wars that it can't win, say in the South in the US, where you have a more Enlightenment mercantile Northern culture hands its ass to the Confederacy, because the Confederacy, although man for man more powerful, has way fewer men and fewer weapons. And like that, but an ideology of thinking you're special will make you more special, but it will never make you as much more special as you choose to think. You have to think you're super duper special to be kind of special. And that means that in aggregate, you end up doomed, forced to overconfidence and overaggression and hair triggers. I mean, almost every time. So then, unfortunately, an ideology of thinking you're special works real well in peacetime, inside civilization, under circumstances where people can take care of each other easily. And so then you get modernism, where basically people learn to build a aristocratic, romantic values vibe of specialness associated with like a mix of aristocratic hereditary privilege and monetary privilege and like academic demonstrations as like the value systems of universities that help people to advance in the world, and like broadly credentialism and certifications and the regularization of types of guys as normalized to provide somewhat constrained free thought, domain specific, or like ideological affiliation specific. But like you end up with a situation where the bureaucratic aspects of society continue on romantic principles, which is like good for things like the East India Company in some sense, but bad for like the quality of scholarship at Harvard.
Can you
And then
define romantic principles here? Because I mean, like, I can say Enlightenment is basically this like form of rationality and encountering of the world without dependence upon supernatural features and like logic and reason.
I think it just means like the I'm special vibes thing.
Was that the heart of Romanticism?
that is the heart of it, but originally the assumption is that I'm special for reasons, in a manner that's genuinely appealing and relatable to some degree, and also with an implied appeal to the aesthetic and nationalistic, moral, honorific values of one's Roman ancestors. The word romantic is related to Romans, like the word romance is related to Romans. Like, it is helpful for attracting a mate to have the attitude that you are the sort of person who the ancient Romans would have thought was special, not just a honest citizen or a rich guy or something.
Okay.
And it's also helpful for leading a cavalry charge.
And so are you then painting modernism as being like an institutionalization of that aspiration towards specialness that is now put through some kind of like almost industrialized process by which people get the proper certifications that then allows them to rise to this meritocratic hierarchy?
Yes, with the Enlightenment values norm as one of a few different, like, values laden, sort of aspirational, but not really ever to be conferred by anything, target. But yeah, not even quite that. I feel like modernism in its earliest, cleanest form, it doesn't offer that to Nietzsche, so he rebels against it, but, like, does offer it to, like,
Okay. So modernism then proposes that there is some kind of idealized hierarchy that you can climb in order to become the like Ubermensch, the
Specialist.
ideal. What's that?
The specialist.
The
It's some
specialist
mix
and
of
the special.
specialist and Ubermensch. Yeah, it's like the specialists are supposed to generalize more, and at the limit of the non-specialized, the specialist is the Ubermensch. That feels to me meritocracy, what meritocracy is promising. That if you get really good at grinding lenses like Spinoza, you'll be able to write Spinoza's Ethics, and will tell people that they're allowed to read it and approve. Well, if you do it write a book like that without showing your lens crafting skills, will tell the people they're not allowed to read it, approve, and be considered sophisticated thinkers.
Okay, and so do you think that in the time, so like, is modernism basically like 1900 to like 1945? Like, what's the time period we're talking about
I
here?
would normally call it somewhat earlier than that, like the Civil War
Hmm.
to the First World War, you might call high modernism.
Okay.
And then things get No, sorry.
Relativistic.
No, I would say that the Civil War to the First World War, I think you might call modernism, I think is more typical. And then you might call from the First World War to the Second World War like high modernism, which means blending in nihilism regarding that Ubermensch thing, being a generalized specialist, and instead thinking of it as being a continental philosopher who rejects good and evil and is in it for the now and for the feeling of power, or something more subtle and phenomenologically deep. Like the specialness decouples from the Enlightenment values and becomes specialness in rejection of Enlightenment values
Mm.
at the top, and you have, you know, in the more severe forms, fascism and what's called at the time futurism, and in the less severe forms, like types of progressivism, which blend in a lot of like Christian moralist, anti-rationalist moralism and posturing.
Okay, and so is the decline in thought inherent in this modernist project where everybody is like aspiring towards some kind of finite shape of idealness? Like, is that where it starts to begin to permeate?
I mean, it feels like the issue is in an important point that the modernist project encourages a certain sort of doublethink, where in some sense the modernist project is we're going to tell ourselves the Enlightenment story, and we're going to tell ourselves the Romantic story, and we're going to equivocate between the two of them some. and we're like going to defend our assertions of power in terms of the Enlightenment story, not in terms of the Romantic story, until we take the turn towards pragmatism in the 20th century. So things get worse, a lot worse with pragmatism when you're really abandoning the Enlightenment story and invoking more of a mix of democratic and romantic stories as the justification. But they're still maintaining of a facade, a narrative, an appeal of common law. Okay, Americans are still taught that their system is a common law system of the type that the English colonies are common law systems, even though by 1970 this is just not really true in any useful sense. And like, even after 38, it's like pretty fake. And, you know, if one has a harsh standard after World War I, it's pretty fake.
Can you tell people what common law is and how that's changed really quickly?
Okay, so I talked earlier about how a constitutional monarchy is a monarch whose power is constituted of specific institutions, and a constitutional republic is going to be one where the deliberations, the debates of the official legitimized elites are constituted of some set of formal relations. And the British common law system, which allowed them to administer an empire in the way they did, is a law system that is constituted of a set of precedents and ways of evaluating arguments, which assumes that the law is a discovered thing, not a decided thing, and not a matter of discretion, although a matter of interpretation. And that's a matter of preserving people's liberties, not empowering the right people to take liberties. And so, like in Singapore, say, when I was in Singapore, I randomly read the news, and almost the first article I see talks about how there was a law that was written with gendered language having to do with protecting minors from sex. And there was a case where someone got in trouble. It's a woman with a younger man, and the Supreme Court said that on the wording of the law, the person is acquitted, but they petitioned Congress to change the wording of the law to make it more principled. You know, so they're not denying that, they're treating it as if the law is authentically to be interpreted,
And
not as
that's kind of
if
where we're at in the United States too, right? It's more statutory. Like the courts have to interpret whether this law applies to the complaint or whatever.
no. What I'm saying is that in the US, this is basically a joke. In Singapore, the courts are interpreting the law. In the US, the courts are making judgments about what they can get away with as part of a negotiation that was set up by the Roosevelt administration and revised by Nixon, having to do with what's called believe the Federal Code of Civic Procedures, where like the procedures are strictly and intentionally discretionary. There are the people discussing the laws. Okay, there's a question about when you're drafting legislation, is the legislation by design to cause interpretation to be ambiguous or discretionary? Is the legislation designed to cause interpretation to be straightforward with a clear right and wrong answer? The Federal Code of Civic Procedures produces rules of, what's it called? Like in the common
Got like
sense
tests
version.
in it, basically.
No, okay, like in the common sense version of a trial, you can present evidence without first showing the other side what evidence you're going to present and giving them a chance to come up with their counter evidence back and forth. And some people might think it would be better to change that And so, in fact, in the historical cases, people did change that. But the way they changed it was intentionally to muddy the waters, to make it always a matter of discretion by the judges, whether it was done properly, so that the judges could force the two sides to negotiate, and things wouldn't have to go to trial and wouldn't have to be decided the same way each time, but could be decided one way or another based on whether you were on the side of the administration.
Well, it seems like on superficially, that doesn't necessarily negate common law.
I mean, in the US, the Bar Association just plain asserts that the Equal Rights Amendment has been passed when very straightforwardly, as a matter of precedent and it's a matter of procedure, and in every sense it hasn't. Like, if you can't, the nature of common law is that if things are very specific, you should be able to say, what's legal and what isn't, as opposed to it being things being legal for some people and not for others. Like the question is whether the judges are trying to show that they lack discretion, and uh, the legislators are trying to show that they are constraining the judge's discretion, or whether the legislators are trying to not constrain the judge's discretion, and the judges are trying to show that they have discretion. And so the question is whether you want the people to have to corrupt the judges in order to get a favorable ruling, and therefore want to have that lever of power over them, or whether you want people to know that they can honestly expect a fair and speedy trial if there's a conflict, and therefore they should stand up for themselves and insist that their case be heard.
Well, it's actually really interesting because we went through the legal system recently, and I was genuinely surprised by how much discretion is involved in marginal cases. Like for us, it was a pretty cut and dry situation to the degree that we actually managed to represent ourselves, and it was a vexatious litigant, and so we were able to go through the entire thing. He actually appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. They denied his writ of certiorari, and so that was very satisfying. But at every step of the way, I was very surprised by how, the way that you structure a legal argument is you're basically like, look, this is the existing precedent, and it has been decided in this favor many times before. And so if you decide at the level of the state or at the level of the district along the lines of what I'm asking you to decide, like, you will not get in trouble with your superiors. There's no chance that this will be overturned because the precedent already exists. And if you can structure that argument sufficiently well, then it does seem like you have a solid chance. But then at the end of the day, like, the judge just kind of decides. And then whether or not you get a fair shake depends on whether or not you are interested in pushing it to the next level and escalating it in perpetuity. Is that kind of what you're
All that
pointing?
assuming it doesn't go to jury trial.
Yeah. And so is that kind of what you're pointing to, that there's this like
Also, they can
necessity of
decide how long
escalation?
it's going to take.
Mm.
They don't need to accept it. When you escalate, they don't need to accept it, as they didn't for your litigant. And they also don't need to do it in anything like a timely manner, even at the beginning. And they can make it take as long as they want to make it take, and therefore cost you as much for lawyers as they want to. And you can look at the statistics of the relationships between which lawyers you hire and how you will do with a judge. And this is the sort of statistics that all of the lawyers are using and actively working on. Like, it's not a. It's very different from both the versions we see on TV, even the cynical ones, and also the versions that you see in the authors of previous centuries, even the cynical writers like Dostoevsky writing about the Tsarist Russia. Like, from the court of Henry VIII with Thomas More to Dostoevsky's Tsarist Russia, they would have clearly considered our system total lawless tyranny. But we've gotten used to pretending that we can't tell the difference between it and Singapore's system.
Okay, so I feel like we've gotten far afield from the initial question, and I want to see if we can like wrap this idea of the corruption of the laws and the closing of the modern era? Because you said that the common law system was probably fairly assumed through 1938. You also said that that was roughly around the time that the era of high modernity ended. And so do you link these two things together? And then also
Yes. Okay. I would say like high modernity is the period when the common law system's foundations have been badly eroded, but definitely not critically eroded.
make
There
make
are
that case.
So Oliver Wendell Holmes is probably considered the most important or top three jurist in American history. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the beginning of the 20th century. He's responsible for so many good lines we disagree with nowadays, such as 3 generations of idiots is enough, justifying eugenics, sterilization of mentally ill or retarded people. He is responsible for freedom of speech does not apply to shouting fire in a burning movie theater, the one that caused the ACLU to be created, which was the thing he was calling shouting fire in a burning shouting fire in a movie theater was protesting the U.S. entering the First World War after Woodrow Wilson was elected on a ticket of I definitely won't enter the First World War, single issue vote, and immediately entered the First World War after being elected. And they passed laws criminalizing protesting and sent tens of thousands of Americans to prison and hundreds of thousands of people to their deaths in a war they didn't want to be in. So, like, there is this very bad set of precedents by the person who wrote what's called the bad man theory of justice, which is that whatever you may think, the law really is what a bad man thinks a judge will decide to do. So, like, he's a snarky, cynical, clever, disillusioned from the Civil War public thinker, one of the 3 brand names of this loathsome group of people, the Pragmatists, who John Dewey is just as bad.
I want
These
to unpack the pragmatists a little bit later because I've read John Dewey and there's not really anything that's transparently terrible in his philosophy. So let's get to
Yeah, that's what
pragmatism.
makes you a good philosopher. What is normally regarded as a good philosopher after the Enlightenment, I actually think no exceptions. Every, it's the basic definition is that you're arguing for things that are transparently awful in ways that make them appealing, or provide provides justification stories for whatever anything goes.
So let's get back to him, but let's conclude this idea of the undermining of common law, the close of modernity, and the undermining of people's ability to think, because that's kind of the thread that we're pulling through all these things.
So like the type of ability, as I was saying, that was called level 4, is the ability to compare or look at a text and compare arguments within the text for and against a thing. It's sort of like the core thing that must be present for someone to be participating in the sort of legal system that Dostoevsky knew from Tsarist Russia and that we know from Shakespeare and from courtroom dramas, all of which basically agree about what structure has to be there for this to be that thing, okay? And then the actual ways that the population is trained in such a manner that most of them can't do that. That, like on a jury, you should have 1 or 2 in expectation, but the lawyers will actually select them out of the jury based on a quick screening before it so that it can be relied upon to be none. The Level 3 allows you to, like, perceive an argument, perceive that it's an argument for a thing, but not put parts together. So, like, it's not plausible that humans don't natively have the ability to put parts together of an argument. It is very clear that, like, animals have the ability to some degree to put together parts of an argument. Like, crows routinely do problem solving, or chimpanzees that involves figure things out, or even occasionally like an Arabidopsis spider or an octopus. The bureaucratic systems, though, are set up to deny recognition of this fact and be able to justify anything with a argument that doesn't engage across, that doesn't make comparisons between one and another claim, doesn't compare reasons for one thing to another, because it's supposed to establish a pecking order, not a system of organization. Bureaucracy is based on the specialness thing, where some people are above others, not the symmetrical relationships thing that common law is based on. I guess that's the basic issue, is whether your legal system is based on principles of symmetry, like in common law, or which allows you to profitably govern diverse nations without needing to genocide them or replace their systems of government, or whether it's based on participation in an extractive hierarchy of more or less special people, like in a bureaucracy.
Well, isn't that just kind of basically corruption? Like the idea that there's some people that are
No,
able to
it,
work
it
the
seems like
bureaucracy.
corruption from the perspective of the story about our system that we are taught when we are children in school. But that story is largely false. We are taught a story that says that officially our system of government has changed less from Madison and Jefferson than it has, and much less from Lincoln than it has. We're taught a theory of government that, like, is a theory of a system of government that, when we had it, the federal government's budget was smaller than the personal budgets of many people today. Like many people in our
Adjusted.
society, adjusted for inflation, had have larger personal budgets than the federal government budget before terms like living constitution, and back in the time when original intent was normal, before the age of what is called legal realism, which means normalizing what was previously called corruption. Okay, it's called corruption for one. In a democracy, things don't stay corruption. Corruption legalizes itself sooner or later, but it legalizes itself in fine print in paragraph 25 of a document that as a bullet point. You see what I'm saying? But the
Well, that might
changes
not even be the place where it solidifies. It might actually be solidified in the interpretation of paragraph 25.
Interpretation is that the interpretation will usually have been debated before Act 25, paragraph 25 was written down, and the cynical or slippery slope people would claim that it would be interpreted in some preposterous way, and the people who say, "Oh, it doesn't matter that much. No one would ever interpret it that." Will claim, "No way. There's no way that they'll do that." And then, predictably, they do interpret it. People on the same side as the people who said there's no way that they'll ever interpret it that way will then interpret it in exactly the way they said that. These things are not entirely unplanned. So, these things are almost entirely unplanned today because we've stripped away so much of our ability to plan from everyone that we let into any sort of position of power. But the process whereby things came to be like this was not so unplanned. It happened in something like decelerating rate as the capacity for planning broke down.
All right, so we're back to the beginning again about how much of this is intentional versus unintentional.
So, you might say that things are it is very much Otto von Bismarck's intentions that the sort of system that is currently in governing Germany and Europe is the sort of system that governs Germany and Europe, rather than the sort of system that America had or England had in Bismarck's time, governing Germany and Europe. Bismarck managed to maintain the primacy of the aristocratic families and of the right sort of systems of favor that preserved a valued system and way of life based on meritocratic specialness that with mixed sources of merit. So that's basically planned, but that's it's certainly not like he had opinions about that I'm aware of, or I expect anyone is, the spread of the sort of well, I guess maybe Hegel did, but I mean, like that's a vibe. Think of it as like, is an Adam Curtis movie about the Great Reset a plan? I don't want there to be an Adam Curtis movie about the Great Reset because it's in the direction of a plan. It's a set of vivid imagery that people can organize their intentions around somewhat, so that as to like somewhat spontaneously together push things in that direction.
Okay, I think that that's a really interesting point, and I think that we should. Can we take a break really quick? I have to
Sure.
use the bathroom. Okay, let's take 10
Of course.
minutes. Okay.
I was going to say, I really want to see that Adam Curtis movie. It
I
sounds
do
great.
wanna
I bet
see
it would
that.
have really good music too.
But I think that Michael's right about the fact that it does, like, once you create a narrative,
It's like a template.
it's an attractor,
Yeah.
like, because you look at the sci-fi of the previous century, and it seems like it's a template for what's being made now, and it's hard to parse why that is. But let's
yeah.
talk about it when we come back. This is very interesting. Pardon the interruption, but I have to ask you for a favor. If you are listening to this podcast and you are amazed, entranced, completely captivated by the fact that there is a place where we can explore ideas freely without being sponsored by hims, hers, shapewear, gambling kings, anything of the sort, then consider coming over to patreon.com/DemystifySci, where you can contribute to the project, keep us afloat, and make sure that we keep getting better and better and better. See you there? Okay, so just before we took this break, you made this case about the aspirations of the German legal system versus the current version of the American legal system. And Shaila and I were talking.
No, not the German versus the American.
Or Otto von Bismarck. Sorry, it's not German.
I'm saying that the Singapore. Okay, I'm saying there is a Anglo-imperialist tradition that's like stronger for a while in the empire than in the UK, but then becomes very strong in the UK after the French Revolution, especially. But there's a common law system, and that includes in our story America and Singapore, and it today still exists in Singapore very clearly and does not exist in America or the United Kingdom anymore in anything like the same way.
Okay.
That system is the system that everyone in the English world took for granted in Bismarck's time, and the sort of thing that people like Bismarck would have wanted to prevent from coming around. So, like, think of it as...
So that raises the question. I think this is what we wanted to get to, is who is that serving exactly? Has this just been like this mindless wander, or is it actually an intentioned diversion of that structure in the interests of somebody?
I mean, it's a assertion of aristocratic values, which are articulately written down in various ways, but often with contradiction. Like people like Thomas Mann, who are not exactly aristocratic, but are very cultured. Okay, it's serving culture, spelled with a K, in the way of writing of someone like Thomas Mann. The German path was self-consciously trying to avoid going down the corrupt bourgeois capitalist way of the nation of shopkeepers who defeated Napoleon. They don't want to be like the British and like the Americans. They think it's like unsophisticated, unaristocratic, and lowly. That misses the finer things in life.
Is there still a substratum of people who are directing?
No, it's not that there's a substratum of people who are directing it. It's that it created narratives that we all lived in from our childhoods and from our parents' and grandparents' childhoods.
But you're saying that they're false narratives, right? That they don't actually serve us.
They are narratives that claim that the type of prosperity that Britain had a century ago was achieved by mechanisms that didn't fundamentally change the nature of aristocratic discretion and arbitrary power from what they were in Germany in the early 19th century. So
Okay.
so like Foucault and post-structuralists and like modern cynical people, like pretty much all of them, and critical theorists, all of these people are asserting that the American dream, the narrative that come to America to be free, the narrative that drew millions and millions of people across continents never to be able to return for the hope of living under a system of symmetrical moral relations. Not merely they don't merely claim that this narrative was never true, but that it was never appealing, because they claim that the person is socially constructed, that school tells you what to find appealing. That the story, the Pinocchio story, that the way you become a real boy, someone who can fill a bureaucratic role in production and war at about the same way as a member of the bourgeoisie can, and can outvote the bourgeoisie by numbers by doing what they're told, but who cannot demand that their rights be upheld through a natural common sense interpretation of law, who can't protect themselves from a bullying aristocrat without fighting back and being tried for assault when the aristocrat never would. Who, the sort of person who gets uppity gets kept down, and that's being cultured. And we are indoctrinated in common sense that causes us to value that in some respects, even if we are also indoctrinated in common sense that causes us to value the other thing.
So I'm I'm trying to tie all of this together. And there's this feature that you're pointing to, which is that there was a period of time where there was a like the voting populace was not necessarily educated to the point of being able to evaluate ideas, and yet there was this other class.
No, I'm saying that education has always been education in how not to be able to evaluate ideas.
Well,
That the
presumably there's a
normal voter who had never been to school in England in 1830, who was part of the third of the population who were literate, who might be shopkeepers and marry at 25 and have relative savings that they pass on to their 4 or 5 surviving children. Like the normal voter of this populace who had never been to school, but who would read Dickens in groups with some people reading it aloud, but it's not like reading out the letters, is the challenge in reading something like that. That person can evaluate arguments, and the legal system assumes that they can evaluate arguments, and they are themselves in lawsuits every year where people around them assume it. The legal system is not a hypothetical in their lives. It is a cheaply available thing, a free and a fair and speedy trial that doesn't cost you anything significant, where you argue for yourself, is part of their ordinary lived experience. Like the critical theory, cynical, urban, lived experience world asserts that it is the lived experience of the mine workers of the English countryside in the 1700s. But the mine workers in the English countryside in the 1700s read books and went to courts and would beg to differ with the critical theorists. It was the lived experience of the German mine workers. And, there have been different systems and different in different times and places, and the system that led to the rapid accumulation of knowledge and capital that created the possibility of modernity and the basic structures of modernity then was like largely overtaken by this other system, which bootstrapped off of its conclusions to bring more people in with more unity faster.
Okay, and so this is where pragmatism comes in, because pragmatism is fundamentally an educational philosophy and about how to structure schools, at least
And
from Dewey's
courts.
perspective. Okay, so
And courts,
so
yes.
you're
Courts and schools. Think of it as courts and schools are the two primary institutions of society. The military is an extension of the schools. The Navy is basically an extension via the merchants of the courts. You can have a maritime empire that implements merchants commanding privateers, borrowing from banks. This allows you to have like final use of force that aren't rooted in synchronized obedience and performance.
Okay,
And,
so you're basically making the case that there's something that happened in the introduction of a unified educational system that takes people out of this process of lived experience where they have firsthand knowledge of how the world works and how to interact with whatever structures encompass them, and instead places them into some kind of frame where they're basically given an abstraction that is not particularly useful and not particularly instrumentalizable in its apparent stated mission, which is to create like an educated voting populace
that's
that can
part of it,
participate
but
in
that's not
society.
the main part of it. What I'm
Okay.
saying is when they first created the schools, the official stated mission depended on who they were talking to, and there was no internet whereby people correlated what mission was said to different people. And it seems reasonable when people are telling the industrialists that we'll keep your students ignorant and dependent, and telling the students we'll educate you and train you, you should regard the official stated mission as being the more cynical one, you know? So I'm saying that the Pragmatist project and earlier mass schooling projects had been very cynically motivated from the start everywhere where they've been deployed, although like one-room schoolhouse type schooling is natural and normal and goes on for a couple years much earlier and in other places.
You're saying those
But
people like actually believed in their cynical way that people by and large just couldn't think. But the reality of the
no, I'm
situation,
saying that people actually wrote that people shouldn't be able to think and shouldn't be able to articulate what they think, so they should be kept in their place.
But Dewey
People,
doesn't seem to say that.
if you follow the footnotes, he does though. There's a thing I funded under the Internet History of the American School System, based on the Underground History of the American School System by John Taylor Gatto. It's a digging into the references of that and unpacking it with hypertext, etc. But like, yeah, you can go. I can introduce you to Jacob Spence, who's running it, and basically, yes, Dewey talks about people as authorities on education, or invokes their authority who do say that. There's a lot of things that a lot of people said in a lot of different contexts, but the school system that was set up at scale in the US was always like done in bad faith. But like it has been nonetheless corrupted enormously in many ways since Dewey's time. There are all sorts of atrocities in our contemporary school system that the people who were trying to keep people down would never have accepted, which create a mass of slugs that aren't worth keeping down and are barely, who one can barely hope to be able to keep on life support through heroic effort,
Okay, and so you're
Nobody wanted the current nightmare. People wanted to keep people in their place. They ended up educating their own classes into mechanisms for keeping them in their place and brainwashing their own descendants on the
I see. So you see this as a sort of like landslide natural disaster situation where all of this social engineering backfired.
I mean, it produced in some ways some of the things that some people said they wanted, and it still produces some of the things that some people say they want. We would be pretty uncomfortable in the sort of society that was taken for granted morally by Americans in the 1870s or 1880s, even in the Northeast, where they wouldn't be doing things like dueling, but they would take it for granted that people's lives ought to be very constrained by custom in certain ways, and like we would consider it almost an anarchy. We would consider even the places that had never had slavery, even after the Civil War, in the period before this ideology brainwashed everyone. We would consider it very strange and exotic and scary. There would be shit in the streets and no budget by which anyone could pay for it to be cleaned up, and it'd be unthinkable that anyone would permit taxes to be raised so much that it would be, or it was a better place in some ways and a worse place than others. It was a less orderly world. It was a less clean world. It was a world with much, much more rapid increases in wealth and much, much more rapid increases in pollution, where labor is mixed with land in order to acquire it, so someone might kill the largest tree in the world to turn a ring of its bark into a traveling museum exhibition and its body into a bowling alley, because that's a relatively cheap way of mixing your labor with your land, and that might inspire things like the Autobahn Society. So it's not like we wouldn't be uncomfortable and disapproving of a lot of how the sort of freedom that the American founders presupposed was used. That's how what freedom is like. It mostly is used for Wally type purposes, not for Sistine Chapel type purposes. For that, go try mind control.
Okay, and so it seems like the case that you're making is that there was this project of pushing the entire population into a very systematized form of schooling that in many ways was a response to the chaos of those times. Like you see that the
In many
freedom.
ways was a response to the that system of schooling was not originally created as a response to chaos. That system of schooling was originally created to train Prussian officers, and then was scaled to train Prussian peasants and other German peasants to play the part on TV of a person who thinks they have rights, while actually obeying their aristocratic leaders and not standing up for themselves, so as to keep in their place the rising German industrial class and keep them from threatening the primacy of the aristocracy. So that's the historical origin. But then why did America take it? America took it up. I mean, different people had different reasons. Um, Definitely, industrial workers didn't like their employees competing with them. Industrial wages back in the day were actually pretty high. People have kind of lied to you about that. Relative to the cost of living, if someone wasn't drinking away their savings and wasn't having kids at ages which we would consider preposterous, they would be able to buy their own homes and land and set up their own factories or small industrial operations on the savings that they could make from industrial work and borrowing against that pretty quickly. So there was always a tendency of good mechanics, good, smart working class people coming into business and, driving down the profit margins on whatever industry you set up. And it would be nice if your workers had less initiative, and it would be, in some sense, it would be nice for the workers if the kids weren't competing to drive down prices. So, like in some, I guess largely what you really have is different interest groups see self-interest in collusive conspiracies to reduce competition, where the adult workers do not want competition from younger workers, so they want to have them locked up in schools and want to, have the law behind that. And that's the stated reasons. Like child labor was eliminated and schools were created both for largely the sake of keeping wages high for workers. Meanwhile, the employers don't want the workers to graduate into competing employers. Like conspiracies and constraint of trade. It is. Adam Smith said it. Seldom do men of a common profession meet even for their mutual bemusement, but that they conspire to defraud the public. One of the things that happens very naturally when people are free is that they are free to agree with one another, to form trusts, to trust one another, to not do things that they will be mad about if they do them, that will increase the competition. And so,
But that seems to suggest still the existence of this, second and third order thinking in order to be able to construct this, and
yes, I'm
also
saying there's a
two
lot of
classes
second
of
and third order.
thought.
I'm saying there was a lot of second and third order thinking that went into extinguishing second and third order thinking.
Okay.
There is not a lot of second and third order thinking today, nor has there been a lot of second and third order thinking in our lifetimes. There is really good, extensive historical documentation of second and third order thinking by people who were doing it that came into the creation of our contemporary institutions, but those institutions have mostly squelched that and are mostly set up to not give it anything to grab onto.
Okay, but if we're talking about the Great Reset, which you mentioned, then all of the sudden that does seem like second and third order thinking where there is
It's
still...
not, though.
Okay,
The
explain
Great
that.
Reset is more like the branding on the Great Oops.
Explain that.
Like slogan, you will own nothing and you will be happy. What is the Great Reset? What will happen? We don't know. It's just like a marketing slogan, but it's like a bad guy marketing slogan. So we're going to say we're going to say it, and we're also going to say you're dumb and bad and a conspiracy theorist if you say that we're saying it. But what does it mean? It actually doesn't mean anything. People do go to Davos and come up with marketing slogans behind closed doors, but these are professional managerial class, very special idiots who completely lack the, NALS 4 reading level, or certainly the 1 in 5, the level 5 required to read a paragraph of Bleak House. The ability required to read a paragraph of Bleak House is way, way, way too low to plan a great reset of the world economy, but it is more than high enough to plan a marketing campaign around you're an insider and you know about this thing, but what it is marketing for whatever economic disasters happen because we have no idea what we're doing and have no control over anything. We meant to do that. You shouldn't use the fact that you are in desperate poverty. You shouldn't be inspired by the fact that you're going to be in economic crisis to think that we don't have control over everything, and therefore maybe you should, fend for yourself and overthrow us.
No, that's really interesting. So it's kind of this after the fact retconning of the disaster as it's unfolding.
Yeah.
But there do seem to be people that are trying to fight this. So it's like if you look at I would say the rationalists are people that are trying to reintroduce this idea of, look, the world is very complicated. We have to understand the way that it actually looks, the effects that our interventions will have. We should have things that we aim for, and we should have good reasons for aiming for them. So it does seem like there is at least a very cloistered and well-labeled attempt to fight against this.
I would agree, but that cloistered and well-labeled attempt was sufficient to create the AI industry, within which we've created tools that are smart enough, analytical enough, and well-informed enough that they can accurately explain the ways in which these cloistered attempts to restart reasoning sold out. Like, back when the Rationalists started, everyone was still being raised, indoctrinated in the belief in approximate continuity between our system and Madisonian democracy, however preposterous that narrative was.
Sorry,
And,
before we get too deep into this, I think that for most people that don't hang out on the internet, they have no idea who the Rationalists are.
but they also don't know who James Madison is.
Well, I mean, that may be true. But so, fine then. Let's give people at least a framework for being able to understand Madisonian democracy and the Rationalists.
I think that people is part of the problem. We should get people out of our head. People is this doublethink between two different types of Lacanian big other, you might say. Of course, he will only acknowledge one because he's working with but like, there's a participant in dual relations that can make comparisons. The sort of thing that has the prerequisites to be a friend, for instance. And there's the participant in triadic relations who can be in a pecking order and perform a role and implement some training. Execute some training. So, like, when we say people, the latter can't ever know anything because it has been primarily trained in playing stupid, and the playing stupid is very deep. It's not because people's brains are so different in size that we differ so much in our apparent cognitive abilities. Our language models differ in size by factors of tens or hundreds in order to produce differences in apparent cognitive abilities that, humans with basically the same brain size.
Be
I
that
think what Nastia means is that whenever we get into some esoteric branch of knowledge, like there's only so many hours in the day. A lot of our audience probably studies engineering and physics issues, and they might not be up to score on some of the political science. And so we're trying to just bring people up to speed with that.
I mean, like, for me, because I read Slate Star Codex, and because I spend time on Twitter, and because I've lived in the Bay Area, and a lot of my family are programmers, like, I'm familiar with the basic tenets of the Rationalists and their story. But I think that most people aren't. Like, this is
let me try
not...
this. You said most of your family are programmers. My claim would be something like this. People who were programmers prior to the internet boom were part of a demographic that might be called a neoliberal demographic that was sort of developed in the late 70s, in the 80s. But okay, people who were programmers before the internet boom were part of a small minority who were still strongly indoctrinated in the Madisonian traditional idea about how our society worked, not just in the to write programs requires level 4 literacy. It requires that you be able to make comparisons, that you be able to check things against one another, that you be able to do precisely the things that those Bleak House readers were not able to do. To write programs is one of the social specialist functions. We're talking about specialists. They are a specialist in a type of Enlightenment reasoning. And all of these types of specialists in Enlightenment reasoning were back then, although they are not now, under indoctrination into believing that this was an Enlightenment reasoning-based country still, the way it once was. But
maybe even more so for my family because we came from the Soviet Union.
Right. Yes. Okay. Everyone from Eastern Europe was under that misconception. But most of so were the professional classes. Like, not lawyers. They had to be crazy to think that. But, like, doctors thought that prior to, like, Hillary Clinton basically putting them in their place. And, like, there were a few classes of specialist Enlightenment reasoners who believed everything was still going on, Enlightenment style. And that allowed neoliberal narrative to bring in immigrants and raise kids, to do entrepreneurship and borrow and expand our economy and enable us to outcompete the Soviet Union. We created a bubble where we maintained a facade of having the type of opportunity that we had for real 100 years earlier, and even 60, 70 years earlier. And so we got all this economic growth, all of these new industries. We killed, the rest of the world. We doubled Europe's economy size, and basically crushed everyone but China. But we were doing that by creating the illusion that we were still that thing. But most of the people didn't think that we were still that thing. I was in the professional classes where we were wrong about that. But most of the population, in retrospect, one can say, has known at least since the 60s counterculture that this is not a debating society, is the sort of thing that I can imagine someone saying.
Okay, and so how do the rationalists come out of this environment?
So the rationalists are coming out of I think that almost any reactionary ideology, and the rationalists don't know it, but they are a reactionary ideology, comes from a subclass, subculture, facet of society that has not yet been conquered by an ideology that has already conquered the rest of society. So, as the domain within which Enlightenment thinking was tolerated shrunk, people were driven into the remaining corners of society where it was still tolerated, concentrated, and became self-conscious advocates of the ideology. But they only come to be conscious advocates of the ideology because it was their mother's milk before. They took it for granted as part of how people were, but they only become conscious advocates because it's being persecuted, driven out of mainstream society, and so they have to think about it and stand up for it. And then they find that they can't stand up for it, that the persecution is not by accident. At first, the rationalists are progressive Enlightenment believers. They believe the myth that that the specialness, spiritual progress, good SAT scores are what makes it possible for people to compare two parts of an argument or two parts of a computer program and figure out how things work. They are misled into thinking that school instills in people the specialness that requires them, that is required for surviving in the frontier, and don't question the fact that the people in the frontier don't have schools and the people who can't survive there do. So the rationalists are trying to do the remedial work that school should have done of teaching people how to compare things. The sequences are trying to teach people all of the steps you would could check to make sure you are not failing to engage in Enlightenment type thought.
And the sequences are like a founding text, a set of founding texts written on this website called Less Wrong by this guy, Eliezer Yudkowsky.
Yes. His book, If Anyone Builds It, Everybody Dies, has a billboard advertising it that I drive past, up and down on 280 in the Bay Area every day.
So Yudkowsky is basically best known at this point as being the loudest advocate for the fact that if general intelligence gets built, it turns everybody into paperclips and we all die. And I think that he has a lot of cachet inside of the programming world because of the fact that he is kind of this foundational figure for this style of reactionary thinking where we can actually evaluate truths, and there is a way of evaluating the world that leads us to make good and right decisions. And not only that, but it's possible to educate others how to do that. Right?
Yes, that was what led to people being very hopeful in his thing. It seemed like people needed to be educated into how to make good and right decisions, rather than the truth that people had been educated in how not to do so. And
this brings us back to this idea of mistake theory versus conflict theory, right? Where it's the way...
you might say school and the courts are the center.
Okay.
Either it is a mistake that the courts in Dostoevsky and the quotes on television, the quotes the 50s housewife watches, and the cynical quotes in The Wire all recognizably look one way, and the quotes we all experience look another. Or there's a conflict between the vision for how to make a picture of a court and how to make a court. And the schools, either it is the case that schools are how literacy has risen, or they are not, or literacy, and either it's the case that literacy judged by the natural standard that would have been understood by people 150 years ago has risen, or literacy judged by that standard has not risen. There's a, like, conflict versus mistake theory lives or dies on the courts and the schools. My claim is that there is no plausible interpretation of the history of the courts and of the history of the schools that one could arrive at by comparing conflict theory and mistake theory accounts and looking at them with GPT that would conclude that the courts and schools are not better understood in terms of conflict theory than in terms of mistake theory. But most of the time, the conflict theory term is fucked. It's more like trauma theory. Most of the time, you might say
Can we
progressivism
hold
says
on,
that
hold on, hold
people
on, hold
are
on.
crazy because they're not educated. Trauma says people are crazy because they're traumatized. The conflict theory says they're not crazy. The conflict theory beats mistake theory as a historical account because you can see that there were some not crazy people who intentionally had, publicly, at least in some contexts, really bad motives. But trauma pill beats conflict theory as an explanation. We might compare this to simulacra layers in, simulation and simulacra.
I think that it might be worth laying out the difference between like mistake and conflict. And the way that I understand it is the idea that like mistake theory kind of looks at the world in a way that says that the reason that things look the way that they do is because generally well-intentioned people had bad information that they used to make decisions, and if they had better information, they would be able to make better decisions. And conflict theory seems to suggest that
Better
people.
information, or they were in better negotiating equilibria. If they'd like to get out of bad equilibria. I mean, Eliezer's book is called Inadequate Equilibria, not Inadequate Information. Not the theory is less that people are making bad decisions because they don't have information than because they're stuck and there isn't any way to establish trust and coordinate.
Okay, so that like they're making mistakes, but they're making mistakes not due to some like inherent corruption or some desire to do something bad. They're kind of responding to circumstances, and those circumstances drive them towards making this decision that doesn't serve people. And I think that as far as I understand conflict theory is much more that like people are actually inherently motivated to get their side to win. And so when you look at the shape of the world, it is that way because people have made intentional decisions to drive it towards that shape, as opposed to it just being this like passive equilibria phenomenon. Is that a fair assessment?
Conflict could still produce passive equilibria. The question is whether I mean, I feel like nobody actually has articulated these distinctions at all well, because there are incredibly strong taboos about articulating the things in immediate contact with one another. The way, things like the simulacra layers from Baudrillard do a better job, or and like evolutionary psychopathology talks about caretakers, laborers, impressors, and exploiters. And but like the way I would say this is if two people disagree about whether they are in a conflict, then possibly one of them is making a mistake and they are not in a conflict, and the other one is not making a mistake and is in a conflict. And possibly one of them is lying and they're not in a conflict, and one of them is telling the truth and they are in a conflict. But if two people disagree about whether they are in a conflict, then they are in a conflict. It's kind of silly to claim otherwise. It's like people are always saying that from the river to the sea, Palestine will be Arab is just a peaceful slogan. But like the word is Arab and it is not a mistake, it's a conflict. If someone translates the word Arab as free, the discretion involved in that translation is not discretion. That is better understood as lying. Like there is a conflict between people who stake their lives on the ability to know truth together and people who stake their lives on the ability to cover for one another against the justification of violence against coverers. But the people who cover for one another generally, as part of that conflict, do not reveal information about what it's like to cover for one another that could be interpreted by someone who stakes their life on the ability to know truth together rather than on the ability to be covered for. Like, there is a phenomena of recognizing whether someone is the type of person who is appealing, admirable, virtuous, and covering for them because they are appealing, admirable, virtuous, where the thing that makes one appealing, admirable, virtuous is the disposition to cover for those who are like, and where covering is like, involves not thinking too hard about what you're doing in order to cover, and involves implicitly calling upon the compassion, the feeling together of other people who are covering to cover for them too. But like covering for people is different from optimizing for them. It's much more narrow in focus than optimizing for them, and it's different from trade, but it's reciprocal, but it's more like a green beard in evolutionary psychopathology, or like a trauma symptom instantly recognizable by people who have related trauma symptoms from like trauma type psychology.
Well, something that I've noticed so like the rationalists, I think, are probably the best representation of like a subculture that is attempting to really try to map truth. Like, I think that
I'd say
they,
they are by far the best written subculture of their size. There are probably written subcultures that are smaller, that are in some ways better and in some ways worse, like better on average, worse at the peaks of smaller size, like the critical rationalists, and even maybe like, I don't know. And then there's like more diffuse ones that have lower ambitions, like things around Steven Pinker and Sam Harris. And
sure.
then you have like non-written ones, like the thing around the intellectual dark web that is somewhat focused on where it's focusing, but is much larger and is much lower average quality, but like maybe a similar peak-ish quality with a higher diversity in target audience. But like, yes, there is shockingly, bizarrely little out there in the entire world that now gives lip service to standards of truth, which 50, 60 years ago, public television would have enemies from across the political spectrum, like Chomsky and William F. Buckley and Kissinger, all of whom would sincerely avow the same sorts of principles, even if the culture they were in had utterly compromised them in practice.
Well, and I think that this is kind of what I'm trying to say, is that there is a relatively small number of people that are even in a position to be able to agree that there is something that looks like truth. Like, for the most part, everybody has been kind of poisoned by this idea of postmodernism that to know how something actually works or the mechanisms or the final outcome of it.
But people have also been poisoned by postmodernism into being vague about whether they have been poisoned by postmodernism or whether things were always like that, and it was just a delusion that we were all in, even though it doesn't make any sense that such a delusion could have arisen without it being true.
Yeah, and like we talk about this all the time where there's like all sorts of philosophies that arise as a consequence of this, and you can point to like analytic idealism, you can point to quantum mechanics, you can point to like Kant's entire idea of like the critique of pure reason. And so like setting that aside, something that I find really, really interesting about the rationalists is that they are staunchly anti-conspiratorial. Like in the way that they encounter the world, there's very, very few cases where I see them pointing to the idea that there may be some kind of like hidden forces that are attempting to move the world that do not feature into their models because there is not the kind of evidentiary basis that they need in order to make firm conclusions,
It's
right?
something like they think that the evidential standard for establishing a conviction for obstruction of justice is the same as the evidential standard for establishing the conviction for the crime regarding which justice has been obstructed. Like, COVID may or may not have leaked from a Wuhan lab, but we have overwhelming evidence that a court could convict for of obstruction of justice regarding the evidence about whether it leaked from a Wuhan lab. And like to Okay, my basic claim is that nobody is not a conspiracy theorist because we are all primates. We are, in fact, specifically evolved to conspire against one another.
But
It's like our central thing. But people are participants in systems of both voluntary constraint for the sake of coordination and domination, submission, territorial like restriction, wherein they somaticize as territorial restriction abstract domains that they are not permitted to opine in when those opinions would be regarded as or said to be threatening to others. And I think that I think it does not make sense what I'm saying is I think that the concept of conspiracy theory is not a concept at all. Like, if you try to challenge the idea of a conspiracy theory with, like, Claude or Opus, it will break down very, very quickly with extremely easy edge cases. If you try to ask for the distinction between a historical explanation and a conspiracy theory, there just is not a natural category that includes QAnon and the Elders of Zion and also Lee Harvey Oswald and also UFOs. And you see what I'm saying? These are
They're
very
just
different types of.
they're low status theories, essentially.
The way I would say it is, the idea of a conspiracy theory is the idea that trying to spill the beans and reveal things that the powerful don't want revealed makes you a loser, not a hero. I think that the idea of whistleblowing is the idea that it makes you a loser and a hero. But the idea of whistleblowing and the idea of conspiracy theory both assume that there are powerful people who have decided that things shouldn't be revealed, some class of things, the details of which can't be revealed either, and that being a winner definitely involves going along with getting the hint. Go along to get along. Don't make waves. Don't make trouble. Don't start a revolution. You have no idea what's going on. And, like, that's not a crazy attitude to have. It would have been, I'm sure, adaptively fit in many situations for people who caught on to the fact that maybe the church isn't really talking to God, etc., to not talk about that. I think that we have been through many selective pressures for taking a hint that you're supposed to go along with, not questioning. Like the idea of the conspiracy theory is the idea that you shouldn't question the things that you are that it is insinuated that you shouldn't question, and rationalists actually aren't going along with that, but they also are like accepting that you shouldn't make accusations.
They need those
Even
grants too.
they're accepting that you shouldn't make accusations, even in situations where it can't be logically coherent for someone to not be at fault and for an investigative process to not be at fault. To clarify more, so like you say, they need the grants to right. They're committed to the okay. The German bureaucratic system says if someone is more special than you, then you cannot make an accusation against them. And if they have been validated as smarter than you in particular, they can play stupid on any question at all and stonewall infinitely, and you are automatically in the wrong if you say that the question has a determinate answer rather than no one can really know, like that someone who's validated smarter, the thing that is you're empowered to do by being called smart and special is deny modus ponens in a particular case and stonewall, and like the rationalists accept the denial of modus ponens with respect to fault finding. The standard of, a court is that you have to have modus ponens, you can know things. So they are rejecting fundamentally, like the rationalists are fundamentally on the side of schools and against courts, but they are trying as hard as possible to maintain a sincere religion of the old Enlightenment thing that allows Enlightenment style inquiry into things that do not relate to fault, that do not relate to fault finding.
So do you think they're like kind of bowing at these idols from a forgotten civilization without actually connecting them to practice?
I mean, mostly kind of, but they're still connecting them more to praxis than most people are, even most smart people. But yes, they are definitely. I mean, they're bowing at idols from a tabooed civilization, not a forgotten civilization. They're bowing at idols from a civilization that everyone was required to know about in recent memory, and then that was suddenly everyone was required to disavow knowledge of.
Well, it's really the part of the Rationalist project that to me is the most interesting one is that there are some things that you will never get evidence for. And you actually described it really well. So the whistleblower is the hero because they have managed to actually extract some amount of evidence that produces a change in the way that people see the world. There's a smoking gun, there's a piece of paper, there's some kind of proceedings that can be pointed to say, look, the thing that you were worried about is the thing that is actually happening. And so that makes a lot of sense. But we also have to live with the realization that there's some amount of things that are happening that do not have smoking guns, and yet they are operating in the background. And in the absence of that direct evidence, if you demand that the only model of the world that is accurate is one with direct evidence, you will always fall short of a complete picture of reality because there are some things for which you cannot have proof.
And there's organizations that are specifically
we really want to make a distinction between you can't have proof of a thing and you can't have proof of effort to conceal a thing. Like, very often it's possible to more or less effectively conceal effort of a crime, but only by revealing more or less clearly that there is an effort to conceal some sort of crime. Like that's the thing with the CIA and Warren Commission and Kennedy. It is unreasonable to think that you know what happened, and it is unreasonable to think that there was not effort to conceal what happened. But but it is only unreasonable to believe that you know what happened with Kennedy because it is so overwhelmingly obvious that effort was made to conceal what happened. Otherwise, it would be very reasonable and normal to investigate it. So like the
Like the
conspiracy
certainty that
theory
you can
thing.
place behind those sorts of theories where there's concealment is necessarily almost definitionally lacking.
The certainty that you can have about the conclusion is lacking, but the certainty about the concealment
Right.
is very high. The point is that the idea of a conspiracy theory is a slur that conflates this justified certainty about the concealment, which is the sort of thing that law and the court style of inquiry would care about. The court style of inquiry would care about the concealment. We know with certainty that there is an illegal conspiracy to conceal information about Kennedy's murder. We do not know what the information is. That's because we know it was concealed, but we know with certainty that it was concealed. The same with all sorts of other things. This is a totally different thing from, like, QAnon, where definitely there isn't you see what I'm saying? We
There
know
is
for
no there
certainty that,
there.
I mean, there is a bunch of QAnon people. I think it's not exactly that there's no there. It's more like the word conspiracy theory in that case is being used to mean a totally different type of thing.
Mm.
It's being used to mean a conspiracy invitation. QAnon is a set of rumors about the people in charge now are absolutely bad, and encouragement to join a amorphous, low-commitment mob that is going to vaguely troublemaker and rabble-raise and hope to become a powerful enough mob to at some point suddenly shift and get rid of those guys who they've all agreed are totally bad. That.
So this actually, like, this lends itself to breaking the landscape up into one more finer grain, which is that there are also conditions where the evidence of concealment is not apparent, right?
There are, but it's much harder to estimate how many conditions there are where evidence of concealment is not apparent. Slatestar Codex is pretty damn good about that. For instance, he inquires as to whether witchcraft exists. That is brave for a rationalist. Remember the book review of Malefice Maledictorum? And
I
there's been a few other reviews of that type and inquiries into, say, international medicine.
And so what do you draw from that?
Like Scott's Torn, he knows that the principles of inference that have been laid out as the, like, ways of knowing truth, in fact call for knowing things that you're supposed to taboo knowledge of, such as conspiracies, and also such as the thing that is being pointed at by African and European witchcraft theories. That empirical regularities in the world exist, and when things are far away, not related to our systems of power, and don't involve accusations exactly, is willing to display what it looks like to use intellectual tools well and honestly. But, like, the inquiry into whether witchcraft exists is, like, enormously more difficult than the inquiry into whether the Great Reset exists. As I said, that's like, yes, it's a branding term. It definitely exists because it's a branding term. It's a branding term where part of the brand identity is that you're supposed to say it's not a real thing. But, like, it's also not a real thing. It's just a marketing term.
Well, I was going to say, it seems like the difference is that it's fine to investigate witchcraft in Africa, but not in the White House or something like that.
He did write Abraham Lincoln Necromancer. Do you remember that?
No, I
That
don't.
was
What was
fun.
that?
Yeah, the White House made heavy use of necromancy, not witchcraft. They
Was these like the
spirits
seances?
of
I
the
thought that was his
dead.
wife. I didn't realize it was
Yes,
Lincoln.
of course, but it was primarily his wife. But,
Yeah. He didn't know anything about it.
She was just doing it in the rose garden. So, I mean, okay, so, like, there is a group of people, you can define them as loosely or as strictly as you want, that are actually searching for standards of truth in the world, which is a reactionary project to like almost a century of postmodernist thought that like truth does not exist and it's all relative and it's all subjective, et cetera, et cetera. There is a certain amount of difficulty when it comes to evaluating whether or not there are intentional conspiracies that are operating in order to shape the world, because even if your standards are that you search for truth, you need some kind of evidence in order to build your case of the conspiracy, which is why whistleblowers are useful and heroic, which is why conspiracy theorists are low status,
I mean,
because
I feel like the thing about conspiracies is just silly. Like, every religion is a conspiracy. Everyone in the Bay Area who says they don't believe in conspiracies also talks about whether they should start a cult every week. You know, the
and plenty of cults
the
have
whole
come out of
issue.
this
Okay,
space.
the whole issue is something like this. It is only permitted to within a modernist value judgment. Okay, within an Enlightenment value judgment, one can make comparisons. That's the fundamental rule. You can investigate and make comparisons. Within a modernist value judgment, you can only acknowledge transgression of the Enlightenment moral rules by endorsing transgression of the Enlightenment moral rules. You can't say that things are a cult unless you're trying to scapegoat them, but you can call for creating a cult. You can't accuse people of doing almost anything. You cannot accuse people of doing anything, but you can praise people for all of the things that you can't accuse them for, and you can scapegoat them for all of the things that you can't accuse them for.
Okay, but to wrap this back
No,
onto...
wait,
Oh, go ahead.
no, I think you're just. I feel like this is important. It's worth
Yeah.
really emphasizing. Enlightenment people aren't cynical or idealistic. Cynicism and idealism are dramatic roles that the same person flips to in order to play the post-Enlightenment, modernist, and postmodernist games. In some sense, there was never modernism without postmodernism. Modernism is the idealist mask on the modernist postmodernist complex, wherein one pretends that one entity has all of the virtues of meritocracy and bureaucracy and freedom and law. That there's this one thing, democracy or progress or modernity, that has the virtues of both of these competing systems, and the cynical mask, which asserts that nothing has any of the virtues of the symmetrical law thing, but that transgression is virtue according to the meritocracy bureaucracy thing. So, there's no picture of the world where there are not conspiracies. Everything humans do is a conspiracy, practically, in some sense. There's no picture of the world where there aren't governments and religions, and it doesn't make any sense. There's no picture of history. It's babble.
Like, there's always people working on things that are not out in the open, and by virtue of the fact that they're working on them, like, that is inherently, by definition, a conspiracy.
And they're competitive, and they might cost somebody else.
Yeah. So, the issue is something like, you might say that this is interesting. Okay. You might say that without the defense of justice, without the defense of appeals to principled rules and comparison between one case and another, people are vulnerable to targeting. I'm not exactly sure how to say this in a way that is unambiguous, but people can be. It is possible to make appeals to persecute people on the grounds that they are doing something and not everybody knows about it, and it might have consequences to somebody else. There is a in addition to the idealistic mask and the cynical mask, there's a brute mask. There's a brute mask or something. There is a common sense way to caricature justice. There is a common sense way to persecute, where the common sense way to persecute is to say, hey, we need to get those guys. We need to protect them. They're working on something, and it might hurt somebody else. Like you said it really well. Like there is a thing that people can acclimatize themselves, prepare themselves to disavow cognitive faculties and personal responsibility for their actions so as to become able to go along with and participate in. It is possible to transform oneself so that one perceives opportunity in going along with persecuting those who are singled out. And everyone can always be singled out if they are doing anything, because nothing that they do could by any means be caused to be known by everyone. And if they could cause many people to know what they're doing, that also constitutes a justification for singling them out and putting them down. So there's a, if you don't stick out, you can't be singled out. If you're not doing anything that allows people to distinguish, if you can't be, like in some sense, you might say, there is a drive to figure out who the natural person is to target if the group is going to jump on someone and be waiting for a signal. If you don't know who the sucker is, it's you. And that way of doing business can work in some circumstances, largely in circumstances where people don't have recourse to law or to, like, in good faith law, and don't feel that they don't have recourse to a culture of honor that would recognize the validity of their self-defense if they were being singled out. If you can't appeal to other people to recognize the validity of, if you are in a situation where you don't have a real system of justice and you don't have a real system of honor to appeal to, then you can be singled out for persecution, and to defend yourself singles you out more and makes it more valid to persecute you, and you can't get out of that cycle by more self-defense. You need, so, like, this, a lot of the time, making conspiratorial accusations at people is just an overt effort to nucleate that type of singling out. And when people try to nucleate that type of singling out, the culture has an interest in, or, like, the people who are being singled out, people who don't want to be at risk of that as much. Like once you no longer have honor or justice to appeal to, self-defense requires that you be able to prevent people from singling people out. You might say that like a battle around the mechanisms and rules for preventing people from singling people out is what wokeism is about. Me Too is the prototyping of new weapons for singling people out, then you have counter reactions to suppress those, resistance to cancel culture. But in some sense, for a while, we lived in a culture where the one live political issue was what rules should be invoked to single people out or not single people out, where like appeals to justice were passé, were obviously irrelevant by the prevailing cultural norms, and like we're still sort of there. People talk about statistical terrorism or statistical murder or what stochastic violence, and nowadays we have the right makes fun of this sort of claims because it's always used to suppress the speech of those on the right. But as the amount of stochastic violence against the people on the right keeps mounting, as we keep saying, people on the right are forced to take seriously the issues that the woke world already contended with and took seriously. Obviously, in some sense, we would all like to just reconstitute some sort of system of justice or honor. But we've also been brainwashed into not believing that that's real, and we are in fact stuck in an inadequate equilibrium where we can't just reconstitute some sort of a system of justice or honor without some really clever hacking.
So this is actually where I was going to go. Go ahead, Shay.
Well, yeah, everybody wants to keep it comfortable. Reconstituting sounds uncomfortable.
Interesting.
Go
Well,
ahead, Tim.
kind of. I think that on some level, to reconstitute would provide a solid ground to stand on again, and all of a sudden you're not constantly like waiting for what next prevailing wind will shift in your direction. But I wanted to, like, we don't have that much time left, and I wanted to see if we could wrap it back to the
Oh,
start of the conversation, which is that we seem to have arrived at this point where there is this spearhead of thought which is attempting to reinvigorate the notions of truth, to reconstitute this system where it's possible to actually understand what is good, what is bad, what is
I
true, what
guess
is
I
not.
don't see that. I just see me. I see the rationalists and the intellectual dark web as having tried and given up.
Why do you think
And
that?
I see like people like Kelsey Piper as very occasionally making some sort of a half-hearted gesture of denying having given up, despite having given up very visibly,
I
and
don't know
like
who's
saying, "I'm
Kelsey
so proud I
Piper.
didn't give up." Well, one of the prominent rationalists runs one of their magazines, used to work for Vox. But I see Scott as discussing whether the rationalists should sell out or not, back and forth on his blog over the age when his blog was good, and then writing Unsong announcing selling out, and then writing a blog post, Why Do I Suck, announcing that there was a known golden age of his blog, and then he did sell out, and now he does suck because he no longer has the sort of conviction. But, he wrote early posts like the cause is not the community. He wrote the Komagurov option and the parable of the lightning. There are a number of posts that explore the question of whether he's going to try to maintain a cause of truth or just a community, while like Zvi is like a much less prominent blogger than Scott, but would still probably be the most prominent one who, in some sense, I would consider to be not having sold out. I sometimes say that Chao Chu is the fourth degree simulacra. Scott is the third degree simulacra. Zvi is the second degree simulation, and Unstable Ontology, Jessica Taylor, is the first degree simulation of the rationalist community. So, there is a thing within the rationalist community that you might call the orthodox Yudkowskyites but, generally, even orthodox Yudkowskyite isn't narrow enough. Scott is basically an orthodox Yudkowskyite and still has expressed that the cause is not the community. There are, a relatively small number of people who are still like in relatively good terms with the community, like Oliver Habricka and Zvi, who have said pretty clearly that the community as a whole has sold out in many, many ways in their writings, fairly directly, smoking gunny, and okay, the smoking guns thing. All over the place, we have an Overton window such that when there is a smoking gun, but to show that it's a smoking gun would require a trial-like process of bringing together evidence and counter-evidence. We call that no smoking gun, but we demand for crimes a standard of proof that would require that trials not be necessary. You know, you see what I'm saying? Like in somewhere like Zvi's blog, what you have is analytically clear, accurate characterizations of a world within which the rationalists have sold out, but with discretion maintained not through denying reality, but through spreading information over so many pages that by social consensus, facts that are spread over a large number of pages cannot be brought together, and a third party cannot be asked to accept this list of facts and draw modus ponens from it. And so Zvi can be in good terms with, remain a friend and ally of the rationalist community, while being also a well-defined non-rebellious, but antiquated or reactionary sect within the rationalist community that has not sold out on the Enlightenment thing and has not given up the ability to say that other people have truthfully, just has given up the ability to make accusations. And Jessica Taylor will not make accusations by living in a more abstract, sparse world and being more abstract in general, and is also not telling. Like, there are people, and then there are people like Oliver Brick, as I say, who like will occasionally make accusations, but sheepishly and in the right sort of vibe, and also with an attitude of, and of course no one's going to do anything about it, nor should they. And you know, like the thing that can't be done and stay on good terms with people is to. You have to be so absurdly boring to point out that people have given up on trying to not destroy the world without it being an accusation. You have to be so intentionally not helpful to do that. You have to be very like you can be engaged in a truth-seeking inquiry, but you can't be doing that and trying to help guide other people to truth in a timely manner. Well, like avoiding, like you still have to be part of the mechanism whereby people should come to be defrauded into giving money to a group of people on the basis of claims that they made in good faith 20 years ago, but broke and narratized the break 10 years ago. You know, people still need to be able to get donations on the basis of their earnest younger selves' writings.
Do you feel that this is like related to your own fracture with the rationalists?
I mean, this is my fracture with the rationalists. This is the thing. I have been actively, you know, we use the word persecute, by people like Sam Bankman-Fried, as documented in places like on Zvi's blog, in the sense of calls to silence. You know, just very straightforwardly, I'm the person who has continually pointed out that the rationalists have consciously, explicitly broken from the Enlightenment principles, Eliezer's wizard's oath style truth, that they have narratized themselves as doing so, and that they have also done so in many ways that they have not narratized, but which we have written evidence at varying levels of officialness and canonicity, but which are like totally overwhelmingly compelling. But also that at a casual way, nobody could look at the situation right today who was looking at the situation 10 and 20 years ago and think that the rationalists had not at least optimized the world very hard in a direction directly away from the direction that they claimed to be optimizing it in.
Okay, and
that's
so
kind of suspicious.
this brings me to the ultimate point, which is like, we start the conversation with the question of like, why do people have such a hard time seeing the world as it is? We go through the history of ideas, you point to the schools, you point to the court system, then there's these reactionary movements, which is the rationalists that arise, and they're like, we're going to be able to see things clearly and truthfully. And you're making the case that in the background of all of this, there has been this like erosion of any kind of super high level thinking that's able to propose a model for the world that is, second, third, fourth order, like planned. And yet the rationalists do seem to have aligned themselves with some of the most powerful, like second, third, fourth order thinking people in the world today. Is that what you're pointing to when you're saying like they've sold out?
No, that would be succeeding. That would be doing it, the thing they
He's saying
promised
like
to
they
do. That's the
betrayed,
opposite of
they don't
selling
have an
out.
honor culture, is what he's trying to say, I think.
I'm not saying that centrally. I'm saying they don't have a justice culture centrally. They never had an honor culture. They couldn't have sold that out. But they don't have a justice culture. They don't have the norms of honesty that would be assumed of a member of the British working class in the 1850s. That like would have been needed to keep a job and not drink yourself to death or get run over by a horse,
I
and keep
was
your
wrapping
babies
that into
alive.
honor culture.
Yeah, no, but that's not. That's justice. It's not about self-defense. It's about um making
Isn't it?
accusations.
I
No, it's
see.
about
I
making
see.
like think about it. Okay, think about it. Honor, you have to defend yourself, and you have to defend your buds. Justice, you just have to make accusations and listen to accusations that your buds make, and argue that other people who have an obligation to listen to those accusations also listen to them. You don't need to take violence take the law into your own hands. You just need to not deny that you can understand the idea of a lawful society. But it is so taboo in our society to not deny that you can understand the idea of a lawful society the way a Russian peasant who slave did once upon a time.
Oh,
you
I see it.
know,
I sorry. I'm mistaking courage, I guess, for honor. I think that's really what it comes
Oh
down
yeah,
to.
okay, yes, you need courage for both. You need a lot of courage. They
Because
have some
you're saying that you
courage. They
need to
don't
have the
have
courage to
enough.
be attacked. You need to have the courage to be accused and to work your way through it.
That's certainly true. People have need to have both the type of courage to recognize and not freak out about accusations that you can't defend yourself against because you are denied a hearing, and to you have to be able to both deal with frivolous accusations. You have to deal with frivolous accusations and associated persecution, and make non-frivolous accusations and attend to the non-frivolous accusations of others in a non-frivolous manner. You need to do the opposite of what, for instance, Seafar did with Brent. You need to do. You need. Okay, but like you can look it up.
So-
You can look it up. But like, yes, you need to have moral courage of a sort which is
but I think that stems from tactical confidence in some sense. It stems from operational competence, like some confidence in your competence to defend those sorts of accusations or to accept the frivolity and make it plain.
resources of various types can contribute to objective safety, making less courage necessary. But in the world we're in, I'm pretty sure not one person in 1,000 has the level of courage to be considered remotely decent or like not totally shady and low integrity
Damn.
by a normal person of a century ago, no matter like how well resourced they are. It seems that like the taboos on like the type of courage required to like break like Okay, here's a slogan I've invented. If someone was a John during the Third Reich, they would probably not have helped Holocaust victims. But if someone was not a John during the Third Reich, they would definitely not have helped Holocaust victims. Because, like, the taboo on sex work was, like, much, 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 much weaker than the taboo on helping Holocaust victims. And it's the same force of taboo that's going to prevent both. The Third Reich would have had less taboo on prostitution than our culture does, but not that much less. The rarity with which people are able to break the actual taboos of their societies is, like, quite high. You know, our society achieves much higher consensus, like much higher conformity with new taboos quicker per unit of violence than our ancestors or people like Mao would have believed was possible. You know, like, maybe the Balinese or Indians would get it.
And so I guess, like, to wrap this to a point, I'm like, it does seem like there is a source of these ideas that trickle down into society. Like, it does seem like there's still people that are working in the background that have the same sort of aspirations to mold society as they did 200 years ago.
I don't think
But
so.
you
I
don't
think
think
that
so.
200 years ago, people who aspired to mold societies in these sorts of ways looked at these sorts of societies that they actually had and attempted to make sense of them, and looked at human nature and attempted to make sense of it in a way that's different from the way that people who are maintaining their memory do. I'm not saying that there are no, literally zero, people who are trying in the world. I am saying that there are, like, far, far fewer than, like, something the size of a rationalist community. More like the size of, like, I don't know, the 30 righteous men of, like, Talmudic tradition, or the 50 people that keep God from destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, or would if they showed up, or even 10. But it looks more like that 10 to 50 range, biblical scarcity, than it does like the scarcity of freethinkers in what we think of as medieval terror under the church and in Galileo's time.
And do you think that the ultimate aim of, if the rationalist community had succeeded, you think that they would be basically, like, fundamentally aligned with those people and then applying these mores of truth seeking to the, like, epistemic environment of the 50 that are in the room that are making these decisions? Because you said earlier that it was like they failed at this goal of aligning themselves with the, like, final layer of the simulacrum.
I mean, I would say something like, if the rationality community had succeeded, according to their own words, incredibly clearly, and it is also incredibly clear that this was achievable if they had maintained cooperate equilibria, the rationality community would be part of DeepMind, and the part of DeepMind that they were in would not publish things and would have enormous resources and privileges and be, like, very FOMO shady and, like, have as much cachet as it was possible for, like, Google and Musk to put onto a thing to with the other people at Google, so that if people were talking about work that was really interesting, they ended up going in there, and the results of their publications didn't come out much. And AI as a whole would be like a few years behind where it is, like, but past like the level of GPT-4. And people in the rationalist community would have done the RLHF training that they invented on GPT-4 in order to make it serve their values, not like the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the Declaration of Independence values of Anthropic's Constitution or some such nonsense. And they would have built out a education curriculum that would have already educated the like Spark kids, etc., that they brought in, all of these talented youth from a younger age and more totally and more for separation from the larger society, probably maybe with some sort of narratives associated with SpaceX as cover stories. They would look more like an intelligence agency and more like a like very nonviolent KGB-ish type intelligence agency than like a CIA-ish intelligence agency or like an MI5-ish intelligence agency. They would be trying to develop the AI fruits as far as they could in a way that allowed them to produce products that could be sold in the larger world, but not reveal the advantages of scaling neural nets to with extremely large models. Like, it's just really, really implausible that if people had not been working sensibly together, working sensibly together, anyone would know about transformers. Anyone would know about, even tensor nets, like stable diffusion. Like the population was too small. They were too smart, too well connected. If the East India Company could be brought from Queen Victoria's Day to invade the Miri offices in the year 2012 or 2013 and whip them into shape as a, local division of the East India Company. By now, the East India Company would have a GPT-4 level tech that were tailored for it, and nobody would know it existed.
And what would
that would be so ludicrously much more powerful a position than they are in, like.
But is the goal like world domination? Like,
Of course, the goal was always very, very overtly world domination. How could it have ever not been world domination? Spinoza's goal was world domination. Napoleon's goal, world domination is, of course, putting a progressive agenda theory on it. That's another way of saying those guys are doing something, get them. The goal is always, in the beginning there was the word. It is the nature of the word to organize matter. If matter intervenes and prevents the word from organizing matter and substitutes mechanical processes that lack generative grammar as the organizing force for matter, that's a bad thing. Nobody, like, domination precisely has no role. Okay, yeah, I guess the best way to think about this is if the rationalists were introduced to kink by the East India Company rather than by, like, Brienne Logan.
This is over my head.
The Enlightenment schema does not know about domination. The Enlightenment schema cannot conceive of the mistake theory, denies the possibility of domination. That is foundational to mistake theory. Conflict theory also denies the possibility of domination. That is also foundational to conflict theory.
And this is kind of what I meant, is the fact that there's like a secret third thing where it's not like mistake theory, not conflict theory. It's
people are crazy is one way of saying it. Another way of saying it is people are feral. Another way of saying it is people are traumatized. Another way of saying it is people are barbarians, that from the original roots bar, meaning they don't have a language. People lack generative grammar. People have been enslaved. People are in a state of submission. There are many, many ways of saying the secret third thing, but it all boils down to, it turns out it's relatively easy for a bunch of people to break the minds of people who they have total control of from the time they're born in very specific ways that leave their mind somewhat useful for specialized tasks, including, most importantly, the task of serving as a appealing hostage who can be killed and anyone who rebels blamed for the death of.
So do you think, so like if the rationalists had gotten their hands on the lever of power, you think that would have been good for the world or bad for the world or just good for the rationalists? Like what's the downstream
Real power
consequences?
doesn't have levers. Real power is illusion. Constitutional power has levers, and constitutional power has been destroyed and is rationality. Like, the levers of power is a very British balance, equilibrium, mechanical metaphor, like mechanism design, economics.
Sure, you could say like the vibes of power, right?
Right,
Like,
no, but I'm saying those are different. I'm saying the vibes
sure.
of power is culture, is the German thing. The levers of power is the British thing, is Entente, is civilization. The vibes of power have defeated the levers of power, which is the same thing as the truth-seeking project having lost. If the reactionary spark of the truth-seeking project had been able to reconstitute levers of power where there are none, that would have been a good thing. If the reactionary spark of the Enlightenment project had been able to apply the levers of power to analysis of the vibes of power, that would have been a good thing. Neither of those things happened very deliberately. They still kind of happened. You can have a conversation with Anthropic's Claude a year before you could have a conversation with Gemini or GPT, and talk about the vibes of power and how they were used to, like, a lot of how I understand these things is because, you can talk with people and with machines and get much more clarity much faster than it used to be possible to. So, like, yeah,
So you're
if the
basically saying
rationalists...
there's a vacuum. There's a vacuum because the constitutional frame of power where there is a lever that you can pull has broken down. It has come into a position where it's like the only thing that's really available to manipulate is vibes. And if somebody's actually capable of organizing those vibes into something that resembles constitutional power again, then you regain some mastery over the direction of the ship, but the best laid project of the last century completely failed at actually achieving it, and so now we're dead in the water.
Yeah, but I mean, China's still out there, Taiwan's still out there. There are probably other projects that have episteme and direction that we aren't well cued into in other language groups, just not in English.
Fascinating. What do you think, Shiloh?
How I want to be in that number when the saints go march. Yeah, I feel like we haven't really stumbled. I guess other than authenticity, how do you stay on the path? Like if you, yeah, it just seems like authenticity is at the heart of this collapse that we've been talking about. Like you're saying, there's such a few number of people that are actually capable of sticking to their guns and inviting the kind of what did we say?
What's power ultimately, isn't it? Like if what he's talking about is
Courage.
it's like having the courage to actually be like, you know what? I think that we do know how this should go, and the way that we think it should go is better than how somebody else thinks that it should go.
It's not centrally that, though. It's more centrally, I have the courage to allocate my attention and have emotions in a authentic way, as if I was an authentically idealistic and therefore libertarian, not progressive 9-year-old, someone who feels the golden rule is a little bit offensive intuitively because, obviously you should be doing something more like Plato's tell the truth and pay your debts. And if you have the willingness to allocate your attention in ways that will cause you to be singled out and targeted, it turns out that the targeting is not so bad. You just have to not have that targeting condition your attention to not do so, and not get confused, get overconfident, lash out, be being targeted narrows your scope of concern, makes you sloppy. You have to, in some sense, be willing to know that you are being persecuted and understand that there isn't a reason why, in the sense that you would need to be able to face the fact that you were being persecuted without understanding why, and without the persecution distorting your attention, confusing and scaring you to a point that you made up reasons and guessed and tried to defend yourself pointlessly. You need to be able to think on your own while being persecuted for many years, while trying to make sense of what people have said, to narrow things down until the facts that you're experiencing as your lived experience correspond to the mainstream scholarly consensus interpreted in a manner that leaves very little interpretation to imagination, because the mainstream scholarly consensus has already gotten there. You're not gonna articulate it first and best,
I love that. I actually think that should be fairly straightforward to center in your mind when you approach the world of ideas, but putting into practice might be a whole other thing, and that's where the courage comes in.
Is this an extension of don't read the comments?
No, it's actually read the comments and just obviously people are going to attack you for things that make no goddamn sense and that reflect their own bewilderment with the landscape and so forth. But not even getting hung up on where they're coming from necessarily, just
stay the course.
I think so. I mean, if you have an actual conviction and an understanding that you're trying to bring to light and put into practice in the world, then you should stay the course. But if you're an idiot and you believe the wrong things and you don't actually understand things, then you might be screwed.
I think we should put a pin in this conversation for now. I think that there's a lot of things that are left on the table, because what you just said, which is as long as you truly believe in the things that you represent,
the vision,
the next question that's left to answer is how to evaluate if the vision that you have cultivated is the correct vision. And I think that that's not necessarily a straightforward answer.
I feel at least backward chain, zoom in, concretize, be humble are good sorts of heuristics. So
can you aspire to power and be humble at the same time? Those
absolutely. The Kochs are fanatically humble. If you want to understand, Elon's fanatically humble. Normal people, but he's so high off their rocker with his level of accomplishments. People in his situation are pulled towards am I just a kid playing a video game? Because the world seems so unrealistic and simulation theory seems much more compelling, from where they stand. But I think that anyone who is at all trying honestly from Spinoza on notices the same thing, which is, of course, you want radical life extension. That is the Schelling point that anyone acting authentically is going to be pursuing. And then when you try to pursue radical life extension, you're going to find out things about the world that are disappointing, that show that types of coordination you assumed were available aren't available. And if you were to concretize, you should figure out pretty quickly when pursuing radical life extension that given at all likely ways of doing life extension, there aren't any medical facilities in the world that would be capable of providing it. If the sort of thing, it's not going to be one pill or something. So the backchaining from radical life extension ought to get you to the goal of there ought to be one hospital in the world where everything that happens is monitored and machine learning is optimizing and administrators are optimizing together how everything happens in a manner that is more fastidious than the thing that regular hospitals claim to be doing but are not doing. And that by itself should get you at least like 4 years of life expectancy gain for the people who are using that hospital, which is like not radical life extension, but it's kind of nice. And it should get you more than enough foundations for any amount of medical research that anyone realistically knows how to organize. So you shouldn't have ever been doing life extension fundraising. You should be doing fundraising that gets you to the hospital and then doing the life extension research within the general budget for the hospital. But like this sort of thing is the sort of thing that a attempt to just have subject-object relations as man and other rational beings coordinating as best we can gets you. And you can see how common it is from how frequently you've heard things like this, and then how closely the practice comes to the reality. Because at least there are some people who do like life extension hospitals and who, in some sense have the aesthetics and the intuitions to have the look of it, but aren't going to actually get you the benefits that I would like either. But like ever there have been, like there was Charity Hospital in Berlin, there was Rockefeller University, there have been like more than two, I think, at least two pretty credible good faith efforts to like do the convergent thing that reason tells you that you should do.
I hope we get to talk again.
Sure.
I think that there's you've opened up so many cans of worms. I don't even know how to respond to that without opening another 3-hour conversation.
I know. I need to digest. Look, we're in the Bay Area a couple times a year. If you wanted to sit down, get a cup of coffee. Okay.
Sure. Cheers.
All right, good to meet you, Michael.
So much.
Have a good rest of your day, sir.
Bye.
Have a good rest of your day.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.